Ethan Walker hadn't cried since the day he buried his wife. But when he saw that woman, hands bound, head bowed, being traded like she was worth less than a lame horse, something cracked open inside his chest that he thought had turned to stone years ago. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. All he knew was that no human being deserved to be sold by the one person on earth who was supposed to protect her. So he stepped forward. And that one step changed everything. If this story moves, you hit that subscribe button and follow Clara and Ethan's journey all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The summer of 1882 was the driest Montana had seen in a decade. The creek beds had turned to cracked mud. The cattle were restless. And the dust that rose off the Billings Road hung in the air like a thin brown fog that never fully settled. Coating everything, it touched saddles, fence posts, the backs of men's hands in the same fine grit of the frontier. Ethan Walker had been riding since before sunrise. He was 34 years old, and on mornings like this one, he felt every single year of it. His back ached from too many nights on hard ground. His left knee had never properly healed from a fall during his Army scouting days, and it announced itself every time the temperature dropped or a storm rolled in from the north. His horse, a big dark bay gelding named Reckoning, was the most reliable companion he'd had in 3 years, which said something about the state of Ethan's life that he didn't particularly like to examine. He was heading back from Caldwell's mill, where he'd gone to settle a dispute about a water rights boundary that Nathan Caldwell's foreman kept pretending didn't exist. The conversation had been short and unpleasant, which was how most conversations involving Caldwell's people tended to go. The man owned half the land between Billings and the northern range, and he carried that ownership like a weapon. Ethan rounded the long bend in the road where the cottonwood trees thinned out, and that was when he saw them. 4 men on horseback positioned in a loose circle around a wagon that had seen better years. One of the wagon's wheels was cracked at the hub. The horses in the traces stood with their heads low, beat down by heat and probably thirst. And in the middle of all of it, on her knees in the dust, was a woman. Her dress had once been blue. Now it was the color of the road, a faded, beaten gray-brown, the hem torn where it had caught on something. Her hair had come half loose from whatever it had been pinned into, and it fell across her face in dark, damp strands. Her wrists were bound in front of her with a length of rough rope. She wasn't crying. That was the first thing Ethan noticed. She wasn't begging either. She was kneeling in the dirt with her chin lifted and her jaw set, staring straight ahead at something only she could see while 4 men argued about her like she wasn't there at all. Ethan pulled Reckoning to a stop. He sat in the saddle for a moment, watching. He was far enough away that the men hadn't noticed him yet, and he used those few seconds the way his old sergeant had taught him to use any moment before engagement to read the ground, read the people, understand what he was walking into. The man doing most of the talking was heavy-set, red-faced from sun or drink, or both, with a thick beard, going gray at the edges. He kept gesturing at the woman with one hand, wide sweeping gestures like he was describing a piece of livestock at a sale. The other 3 men were younger, quieter, listening with the particular interest of men who had money in their pockets and were deciding whether to spend it. "She's strong enough," the heavy-set man said. "And she's got sense enough to cook and keep house. Domestic work, that's what she's suited for." One of the younger men leaned with a narrow face under a flat-brimmed hat crossed his arms. "And who are you to be selling her?" "Her brother, which gives me every right." Ethan's hands tightened on the reins. "Every right," the lean man said. "Brother's got the right to sell his sister now." "She's a burden," the heavy-set man said flatly. "Been a burden since our father died. I got 3 kids and a wife and a place that's barely holding. I can't afford to keep feeding a grown woman who brings in nothing." The woman on the ground didn't move, didn't flinch. She kept that chin up, kept that jaw set, and Ethan understood in that moment that whatever she was feeling, and she had to be feeling something, because she was human. And this was her brother saying these words about her in front of strangers. She had decided that these men would not see it. That decided him. He touched his heels to Reckoning's sides and rode forward at a walk unhurried, keeping his hands visible and his body loose in the way a man learned to do when he wanted to be seen as non-threatening right up until the moment he wasn't. The heavy-set man noticed him first. "Road's busy today," he said, narrowing his eyes. "Seems to be." Ethan brought Reckoning to a stop a few yards out and looked at the woman. She had turned her head at the sound of hooves, and for the first time he could see her face clearly. She was younger than he'd expected, mid-20s maybe, though her eyes were older than that. Dark eyes sharp, and assessing the kind that had learned to take in a situation fast and determine what it meant. She looked at him the way a person looks at someone when they've learned that people are unpredictable, and you need to know as quickly as possible which kind this one is. He held her gaze for 2 seconds, just long enough he hoped to answer her question. Then he looked at the heavy-set man. "What's going on here?" "Private business," the man said. "Keep riding." "Can't quite do that." Ethan kept his voice even. "See, I'm looking at a woman tied up on the side of the road, and that tends to hold my attention." "Like I said, private." "Name's Ethan Walker," Ethan said like the man hadn't spoken. "I run the Walker Ranch north of here about 8 miles. And I'm going to need somebody to explain to me what I'm seeing, because what I'm seeing looks a lot like something I don't intend to ride past." The lean man with the flat-brimmed hat had leaned back slightly on his horse, putting some distance between himself and the situation. The other 2 younger men exchanged a look that Ethan read without difficulty. They had money and interest, but they hadn't come out this morning looking for trouble, and this was beginning to smell like trouble. The heavy-set man planted his fists on his hips. "I told you, private business between family." "She's your sister, you said." The man's eyes sharpened. "You were listening." "Road carries sound. She have a name." A pause. Then unexpectedly the woman spoke. "Clara," she said. Her voice was steady, steadier than Ethan would have managed in her position. "Clara Whitmore. And yes, he is my brother. And yes, those are my hands tied together. And before you ask, no, I don't know exactly what he told these men about me, but I imagine it wasn't the truth, because the truth doesn't tend to serve his purposes." Her brother's face went dark red. "You shut your mouth." "I've been shutting my mouth for 2 years, Joseph," she said. "I don't believe it's done either of us much good." Ethan swung down from Reckoning's back. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't make any move that could be read as aggressive. He just stepped down onto the road, dropped the reins loosely. Reckoning would stand, and walked forward until he was standing between Clara and the 4 men close enough that stepping around him would require intention. "Here's what's going to happen," he said quietly. "Those ropes are going to come off her wrists. She's going to stand up, and then we're going to have a conversation about what comes next." "You got no authority here," Joseph Whitmore said. "No, I don't." Ethan met his gaze without blinking. "I've got something else. I've got the willingness to stand here until sundown if that's what it takes. And I've got the kind of patience that men who are trying to do wrong don't usually enjoy." Something shifted in the air. The lean man in the flat-brimmed hat touched 2 fingers to the brim and turned his horse. "I didn't come out here for this," he said, and rode away without looking back. The other 2 followed within seconds, and the sound of hoofbeats faded down the road until it was just the hot wind and the low creak of the wagon and the buzzing of flies. Joseph stared at Ethan. His face had gone through several colors in the last minute and settled on something between fury and calculation. "Those were paying customers," he said. "They were men who'd left already," Ethan replied, "which tells you something about how solid your arrangement was." "She owes me." "For what?" Joseph's jaw worked. 2 years of keeping her, feeding her, housing her after she came back with nothing and nowhere to go and dragged our family's name into... "Joseph." Clara's voice came from behind Ethan, still level, still controlled. "Don't? You don't tell me?" "I'm asking." A pause. "What's left of me is asking." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. Ethan crouched down in front of Clara. Up close he could see that her wrists were raw under the rope she'd been fighting it at some point, or it had been on too long in the heat. He pulled the small folding knife from his belt and looked at her first before he touched the rope. "All right?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. That same rapid assessment. Then she gave a small, tight nod. He cut the rope. She brought her hands in front of her and looked at her wrists without expression, pressing her thumb against one of the red marks like she was checking to see if it was real. Then she looked up at him. "Why?" she said. "Why what? Why did you stop?" He thought about it. He could have said something about honor, or about the law, or about what a man does when he sees something wrong. All of those things were true. But they weren't quite what she was asking. "Because you weren't crying," he said. She blinked. "That's your reason. Crying would have made sense. Most people in your position, they'd be crying and begging and hoping one of these men might feel sorry enough to help. But you weren't doing that. You were just holding on." He stood up, extended his hand. That seemed like something worth stopping for. She looked at his hand for 3 full seconds before she took it and let him help her to her feet. She was taller than he'd expected. She stood straight as a board once she was upright, squaring her shoulders in a way that looked automatic, like it was something she'd trained herself to do when everything in her wanted to fold. Joseph Whitmore was still standing by his wagon, and the expression on his face had moved into territory. Ethan recognized the particular look of a man who knows he's lost the practical ground and is trying to decide if he wants to fight about it anyway. "She's got nothing," Joseph said. "You understand that no money, no clothes worth speaking of, no family that'll claim her after what she did. You take her off this road, she becomes your problem." "Then she's my problem," Ethan said. "You don't know what you're taking on." Ethan looked at Clara. She was watching her brother with an expression that was carefully, deliberately empty, the look of a woman who had cried all the tears she was going to cry over this particular wound, and was now simply enduring the scar. "I know enough," he said. Joseph stared at him for a moment longer. Then he muttered something under his breath that Ethan chose not to hear, climbed up onto the wagon seat, and turned the horses back toward town without another word. The wagon rolled away, cracked wheel and all, and the road was quiet again, except for the wind. Ethan stood next to Clara in the dust and the heat, and watched until the wagon was around the bend and out of sight. Then Clara said, "I'm not going to thank you." He raised an eyebrow. "All right." "Not because I'm not grateful. I am." She rubbed her wrists. "But I've been thanking men for the last 2 years, and it always seems to come with a price I didn't agree to. So I'm holding off on the thank you until I understand what this costs." Ethan considered that. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in a while. "It costs nothing," he said. "I've got a ranch about 8 miles north. You can ride with me, get cleaned up, have a meal. After that, you decide what you want to do. No conditions." She studied him. "You always take in strangers?" "No," he said honestly. "Can't say I do." "Then why me?" He picked up Reckoning's reins. "I already told you." She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the dry cottonwood leaves above them with a sound like paper. "The not crying," she said. "Yeah." She looked down at her hands again at the marks the rope had left. Then she looked at the empty road where the wagon had gone. Something moved across her face there, and gone too fast to name. Though Ethan thought it might have been grief, or maybe relief, or the particular exhausted mixture of the two that happens when something you've been dreading finally arrives and turns out to be survivable. "Walker Ranch," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You live there alone. Have for 3 years. She looked at him sidelong. "What happened 3 years ago?" It was a direct question, the kind that people usually softened with preamble. She hadn't bothered, which he found he didn't mind. "Lost my wife," he said. "And my son. Fever." A pause. "I'm sorry," she said. And the simplicity of it, no elaboration, no excessive sympathy. Just those 2 words offered straight hit him somewhere unexpected. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once. Then, "All right, I'll ride with you to the ranch." "Good. But I'll walk the horse. I don't ride." He handed her Reckoning's reins without comment, and they started up the road, the big horse walking placidly between them, the sun pressing down on their shoulders, the dust rising and settling around their boots. They walked in silence for a while. Ethan didn't push conversation, and Clara didn't offer it. The silence was the kind that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of two people who didn't yet know each other, but were trying to figure out what the other one was made of. After maybe 10 minutes, Clara said, "What he told those men, about me being a burden." "You don't have to explain anything," Ethan said. "I know I don't." She was quiet for another moment. "I'm not explaining. I'm just telling you so you don't hear it from someone else first and have to wonder. My husband died. We had debts I didn't know about. The bank took everything. I went back to Joseph's because I had nowhere else. That's the whole story." Simple as that. Simple as that. Her voice didn't change. People in town added things to it, the way people do, made it into something it wasn't. Joseph started to believe the additions more than the truth, I think, because the additions gave him permission to do what he wanted to do anyway. Ethan thought about Nathan Caldwell and the water rights, and the way powerful men in this territory had learned to construct narratives that made their worst impulses sound like reasonable business decisions. He understood what she was describing. "The additions," he said. "What kind?" She glanced at him. "The usual kind. For a woman in my situation." He nodded. He didn't press. Walker Ranch came into view about a mile further down the road, the main house first, then the barn, and the outbuildings, all of it solid and functional, without being much to look at. He'd built most of it himself over the years before Margaret died, when there had been a reason to build things that would last. Clara stood at the gate and looked at it for a long moment. "It's a working ranch," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You run it alone." "I've got 2 hands, brothers Tom and Will Parsons, good men." He opened the gate. "Come on in." She stepped through the gate, and Reckoning followed her, and Ethan came last, latching it behind them. Tom Parsons was coming out of the barn when they came into the yard, and he stopped dead at the sight of Clara. He was 22, sun-browned with an open face that showed everything he was thinking, and what it showed right now was pure bewilderment. "Boss," he said. "You, He cleared his throat. "Brought someone." "This is Miss Whitmore," Ethan said. "She'll be staying for a while. Get Will and make sure the back room is aired out." Tom looked at Clara. Clara looked at Tom with the expression of a woman waiting to see what someone would do with information. "Yes, sir," Tom said, and disappeared back into the barn, without further comment, which was one of the things Ethan valued most about him. Ethan showed Clara to the house, which was clean. In the way that a house kept by a man alone was clean functional. Nothing extra, nothing decorative, the kind of order that came from necessity rather than care. She walked through it with her eyes moving, taking inventory, the way a careful person does in a new place, noting where things were, what was there, what wasn't. "Back room," he said, showing her the small room off the kitchen that had been storage before, and still had some boxes in the corner, but had a bed and a window and a door with a latch. "It's yours. The latch locks from the inside." She looked at the door, at the latch. "Thank you," she said, and this time she said it without the qualifier. "There's water in the pitcher on the kitchen shelf. Food in the larder if you're hungry." He took a step back. "I'm going to see to Reckoning and then check on the north pasture fence. You don't need to do anything. Just rest." She turned from the door. "I don't do well with not doing anything. Miss Whitmore." "Clara." He paused. "Clara, you've been tied up on a road in the heat. It's all right to rest." She looked at him with those direct, dark eyes. "What time is supper?" He gave up. 6 o'clock. "I'll have it ready," she said. "If you tell me where things are." He told her where things were. He went out to the barn, and when he glanced back once through the kitchen window, she was already moving, not frantically, not trying to prove anything, just moving with the focused economy of a person who knew how to work and found it perhaps the only reliable comfort available. He stood watching her for a moment through the glass. 3 years since he'd seen someone move through that kitchen. He went to see to his horse. Supper that evening was the best meal that had been made in the Walker Ranch kitchen in 3 years, and Ethan sat across from Clara and ate it, and said very little because there was not much he trusted himself to say. Tom and Will Parsons were at the table too, and they were not so practiced at restraint. "This biscuit," Tom said, holding one up like evidence. "Miss Whitmore, where did you learn to make biscuits like this?" Clara across from him almost smiled. "My mother. She believed a woman's biscuit recipe was the most important thing she could pass on." "She was right," Tom said with conviction. Will Parsons, who was 25 and slightly more reserved than his younger brother, said, "You been on the road long?" The almost smile faded. "Long enough." Will heard the edge in it and had the sense to move on. "Well, it's good to have someone in the house. Gets awful quiet." He said it without guile, the way a young man says something true, without quite understanding all the ways it lands. Ethan looked at his plate. Clara looked at hers. "Yes," she said quietly. "I imagine it does." After supper, after Tom and Will had gone back to the bunkhouse, Clara washed the dishes, and Ethan dried them, which was not a division of labor he had planned, but seemed to happen naturally. They worked without talking, and the kitchen was full of the ordinary sounds of that work water, the clink of crockery, the soft thud of a plate being set down. Finally, Clara said, "You're going to want to know." "Know what? What happened? Why Joseph had me on that road? The full version, not the short one I gave you." Ethan put down the dish he was drying. "You don't owe me that." "I know." She was looking at the window over the sink at the reflection of the kitchen in the dark glass. "But I don't like being in debt to someone who's doing me a kindness based on incomplete information. It feels dishonest." He leaned against the counter, waited. She kept her eyes on the dark glass. "My husband was a good man, or I believed he was. We had a farm in Nebraska, not a big one, but ours. Paid for, or I thought it was." A pause. "He died 2 years ago. Influenza. Quick. The kind where they're there in the morning and gone by night." She was quiet for a moment. "After the funeral, a man came from the bank in Omaha. Turned out my husband had borrowed against the property twice. The second time without telling me. Had plans to expand. He said the banker, I mean. He was almost apologetic about it, as if that helped." It didn't. "No." She turned the water off, dried her hands on the cloth hanging from the hook. "I had 30 days to vacate. I packed what I could carry, and I went to Joseph's because there was nowhere else to go. Joseph had a wife who didn't want me there, and 3 children, and a small house, and a resentment toward me that went back to before our father died, though I've never entirely understood why. I tried to earn my keep. I cooked and cleaned and helped with the children. But every month it got worse, and last week Joseph came to me and said he'd made an arrangement." She put the dishcloth down very carefully, very precisely. "He didn't call it what it was. He had words for it that made it sound like employment, like he was doing me a favor." "He was selling you," Ethan said. "He was selling me." She said it without inflection, as if she had said it to herself enough times that the word had worn smooth. To the highest bidder among men who wanted domestic labor without the inconvenience of negotiating. He'd been making inquiries for 2 weeks apparently. I found out this morning when he tied my hands. Ethan stood very still. "He tied your hands this morning," he said. "He was afraid I'd run." A small bleak pause. He was right. The kitchen was quiet. Through the wall they could hear the wind picking up outside, and somewhere out in the dark, a coyote called and was answered. "Nathan Caldwell," Ethan said slowly. She turned her head. "What about him?" "You said your husband borrowed against the property twice. The second time." He was thinking, working through it. "Was the second lender from around here out of Montana?" Clara's eyes sharpened. "I don't know who the second lender was. The bank in Omaha said the note had been purchased, Sold to another party. Why? Caldwell buys notes, Ethan said. It's one of the ways he acquires land. He buys the debt and then calls it in. Clara was very still. You think he bought my husband's note? I don't know, but it's possible. He met her eyes. And if he did, that means it wasn't just bad luck that put you on that road. She looked at him for a long moment. And something shifted in her face. Not fear exactly, but the particular look of a person who has just understood that the disaster they thought was behind them is actually still moving. He wouldn't care about me, she said slowly. I have nothing. No. But if your husband's farm is still tangled up in the debt, and if Caldwell wanted clear title to it... He stopped. I'm speculating. I don't know. But it might be worth finding out. Clara was quiet for the long moment, looking at nothing, and Ethan watched her think. She didn't think the way some people did, visibly and with a lot of movement. She went still, and her eyes went distant, and he could almost see the pieces going into order behind them. The bank in Omaha, she said finally. They would have records of who bought the note. They would. And you know people around here. People who would know if Caldwell has been involved with that kind of purchase. Some, he said. Yeah. She looked at him directly. Why would you do that? Look into this, for me. He thought about it honestly. Because you told me the truth, he said. About all of it, including the part about not thanking men who might want something in return. He picked up the dishcloth she'd put down and hung it back on the hook. I'm not going to want anything in return, Clara. But I understand why you'd need to see that proved. She held his gaze for a long moment. All right, she said finally. All right, he agreed. She went to her room. He heard the latch click, the inside latch, the one he'd made sure was there. And he stood in the kitchen for a while, after listening to the coyotes and the wind, and thought about debt, and about the way bad luck and bad men so often moved together until you couldn't tell one from the other. Then he put out the lamp and went to bed. He did not sleep easily. But for the first time in a long time, the silence of the house didn't feel like weight. It felt in some way he couldn't have explained, like it was holding something worth keeping. Clara was up before dawn. Ethan knew this because when he came down at first light, the kitchen fire was already going, the coffee was already made, and there was a pan of something on the stove that smelled like cornbread. Clara was standing at the kitchen table, sorting through a box of dry goods, with the focused attention of a woman conducting an inventory, moving tins and paper-wrapped packages from one side to the other, and making small sounds of assessment under her breath. She didn't look up when he came in. You don't have enough salt, she said. And your flour is half gone. You'll need to go into town before the end of the week. Ethan poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the doorframe. Good morning to you too. She glanced at him, then a quick sideways look that might have been the beginning of an expression before she suppressed it. Good morning. Then back to the box. The cornbread will be ready in 10 minutes. He sat down at the table. You didn't have to do this. I know. I meant what I said last night. You're a guest. You don't need to earn your place here. She stopped moving tins, turned to look at him fully, and there was something in her face that was neither gratitude nor resentment, but something more complicated than either. I know what you meant, she said, and I believe you meant it. A pause. But I need to be doing something, Mr. Walker. If I'm just sitting, I'm just thinking. And right now thinking is not particularly good for me. He understood that, more than he could comfortably say. Ethan, he said. She blinked. What? If we're going to be in the same kitchen before sunrise, Mr. Walker seems formal. The corner of her mouth moved. Ethan, she said. The word was careful, like she was testing the weight of it. All right. Tom and Will came in for breakfast 20 minutes later, and ate with the wholehearted enthusiasm of young men who had been living on Ethan's cooking for months and had strong opinions about the improvement. Tom in particular ate 3 pieces of cornbread and would have gone for a 4th if Clara hadn't moved the pan. Boss. Tom said, wiping his mouth. "With all due respect, your cooking is terrible." "I know," Ethan said. "Like, genuinely bad." "Tom," Will said. "I'm paying a compliment," Tom said, "to Miss Whitmore, indirectly." Clara looked at Tom with an expression that was very nearly warm. "Thank you, Tom. Indirectly." Tom grinned at her like she'd handed him a gift. It was such a small moment, such an ordinary small moment, a young man eating breakfast and a woman half smiling over a cornbread pan. And Ethan sat at the head of his table and felt something move in his chest that he hadn't felt in 3 years. Something that was almost painful in its ordinariness. And he looked down at his coffee, so no one would see it on his face. After breakfast, he took Clara out to the property, not because she'd asked, she hadn't, but because if she was going to be here for any length of time, she should know where things were and how they worked. That was what he told himself. He showed her the barn, the paddock, the chicken coop, the kitchen garden that had gone half wild because he hadn't had the heart to keep it up after Margaret died. Clara walked alongside him, with her hands clasped in front of her, and her eyes moving over everything, asking precise and practical questions. How many head of cattle? Where did the water source come in? How far to the nearest neighbor? "The Hendersons are about 4 miles east," he said. "Ruth Henderson's a good woman. You'd like her, I think." "Have you told her about me?" "Not yet. Word will get around soon enough." She stopped walking. "What kind of word?" He turned to look at her. "The true kind, if I have anything to say about it." "You won't have anything to say about it," she said quietly. "That's not how it works, and you know it. Whatever story gets told in town about why I'm here, the true version will be the least popular one." She looked at him steadily. "I need to know how much does that cost you in this community, because I won't be the reason you lose standing you've spent years building." It was such a direct question, and asked with such a complete absence of self-pity that it stopped him. "Why does that concern you?" "Because you did me a kindness," she said. "And I've seen kindness cost people, and I don't want it to." He held her gaze. "Let me worry about that." "Ethan?" "Clara." He said her name like a period. "Let me worry about that." She pressed her lips together, then gave a short nod, the kind that meant she was agreeing for now, but reserving the right to reopen the question. They finished the walk in relative quiet. When they came back around toward the house, Will Parsons was coming from the direction of the road, with a look on his face that Ethan recognized the look of a man who'd heard something unpleasant and was trying to figure out how to carry it. "Ryder came through," Will said. "From town. Said there's talk." "About?" Will glanced at Clara, then back at Ethan. "About you bringing a woman back. Said folks are, well, they're saying things. About who she is. Where she came from." Another glance at Clara. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. I'm just telling us," Clara said evenly. "What are they saying?" Will pulled his hat off, turned it in his hands. "That you ran out on debts, in Nebraska, that your husband's farm went under and you left behind money you owed people." Clara's face didn't change. Not in a way anyone who didn't know to look would have noticed. But something happened behind her eyes, a quick and terrible flash of something, and then it was gone. "The debts were my husband's," she said, "not mine. I had no legal knowledge of them and no legal liability for them. But that's a fine point, and fine points don't travel well." "No, ma'am," Will said miserably. "They don't." Ethan looked at her. She was standing very straight the way she'd stood on that road, with her hands bound, with that same quality of choosing actively and consciously what she would let the world see. "Who was the rider?" Ethan asked. "Man named Greer. He works for Caldwell." The name dropped into the morning like a stone into water. Clara turned her head slowly to look at Ethan. He looked back at her. "Well," she said very quietly, "that answers your question from last night." "It's a start," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's trying to move me off before I can ask questions. If I'm driven out of the territory by reputation, I can't make inquiries about the note on my husband's farm." "That's what I'd guess." "So, what do we do?" He hadn't expected the "we." Or maybe he had because it didn't surprise him. It sat there between them, that small word, and something about it felt more solid than a lot of things he'd been standing on lately. "First," he said, "we go into town." Her chin came up. "When?" "Today." The ride into Millhaven took the better part of an hour, and Clara sat straight in the wagon seat the entire time, looking at the road ahead, with the expression of someone who has made a decision about their own conduct and is holding to it by will. "You don't have to come in," Ethan said as they came into the edge of town. "Yes, I do," she said. "If I hide, it means the story is true. I won't hide from a lie." He looked at her. "All right." Millhaven in 1882 was not a large town, but it was an established one. A main street with a general store, a bank, a saloon, a church, a telegraph office, and all the residences clustered around them. The kind of town that had a social order as rigid as any eastern city, just expressed differently. And in a town like that, a stranger arrived under ambiguous circumstances was the event, and people would arrange themselves around it. They arranged themselves. Ethan could feel the weight of eyes from the moment the wagon came down Main Street. A turning of heads, a shift in the rhythm of foot traffic. A woman on the general store porch who stopped sweeping and didn't start again. He was known here. He had standing here. But he could feel how quickly standing could become a liability when you set yourself on the wrong side of what a town had already decided. Clara sat next to him and let herself be seen. He pulled up in front of the general store and helped her down, and she stepped onto the boardwalk and smoothed her dress, the same blue-gray dress repaired where he'd noticed a tear in the hem, and he wondered when she'd done that. How early she must have been awake, and looked down the street with her chin level. "Mrs. Pearson runs the store," he said quietly. "She's fair. Don't let her expression put you off. She looks severe even when she isn't." Clara nodded and followed him inside. Mrs. Pearson was a woman of 60 with silver hair and the kind of face that had deep-cut expression lines from decades of making her feelings known without speaking them. She looked up from behind the counter when they came in, and her eyes moved from Ethan to Clara and back. "Ethan," she said, "Mrs. Pearson, need some things." He put his list on the counter. "And I'd like to introduce Clara Whitmore. She'll be staying at the ranch for a time." Mrs. Pearson looked at Clara. Clara met her gaze without flinching. "Miss Whitmore," the older woman said. "Mrs. Pearson," Clara replied. Her voice was warm and even, the voice of a woman who had decided that if she was going to be judged, she would be judged for what she actually was, not for what she might appear to be if she shrunk. "I've heard you carry a good selection of mending supplies. I'm hoping you can help me find what I need." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in Mrs. Pearson's face. "What kind of mending?" she asked. "Practical kinds. I have very little with me, and I'd rather make do than ask for charity." A pause. Mrs. Pearson looked at Ethan, then back at Clara. "Come around to this side of the counter," she said, and turned without waiting to see if Clara would follow. Ethan exhaled slowly. He went to pick up his list and almost walked directly into Hector Greer. Greer was a lean man in his 40s, with a face like cured leather, and eyes that were always slightly amused in the way of someone who enjoyed having information other people didn't. He worked as a kind of general agent for Nathan Caldwell, which meant he did things that Caldwell didn't want attached directly to his own name. "Walker," Greer said pleasantly. "Greer, heard you had a passenger on the way back from the Mill Road yesterday." Greer tilted his head toward Clara, who was now on the other side of the counter talking to Mrs. Pearson with her back to them. "That's Miss Whitmore. She's a guest at the ranch." "Guest." Greer turned the word over like he was checking its weight. "Funny word for someone who came off the road like she did." Ethan's voice went very flat. "Choose your next sentence carefully." Greer raised both hands, palms out, the gesture of a man performing innocence. "Just talking. Mr. Caldwell wanted me to convey his concern about a stranger arriving in the territory under unusual circumstances." Nathan Caldwell's concern about strangers in this territory is something I'll lose sleep over, Ethan said, right after I stop. Greer smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. He's going to want to meet her. No. He's going to insist. He can insist all he wants, Ethan said. She's on my property and under my roof, and Nathan Caldwell's won't stop at my fence line. Greer's smile held. For now, he said, and stepped past Ethan to the door. Ethan stood still for a moment, feeling the cold that Greer's pleasantness always left behind, the specific chill of a man who doesn't bother with threats because he doesn't need to. Then he picked up his list and went to the counter. Clara was there holding a spool of brown thread and a packet of needles, and she spoke low when he reached her side. That man works for Caldwell, she said, not a question. Yes. He was watching me the whole time, from across the store. I know. He knows who I am, or who he thinks I am. Her voice was completely steady, but he could see the effort it took, the deliberate control of breath, the way her fingers had tightened slightly around the spool. This was his doing. The rumors. The writer he sent. Most likely. She set the spool on the counter and turned to look at him directly. Why, what does he gain from driving me off before I can even... She stopped. Her eyes went sharp. The farm. My husband's farm. Is there something on it he wants? There might be. What? Water, he said simply. Your husband's property in Nebraska. Do you remember where the creek ran through it? Clara was very still. Along the north boundary. It was the best part of the property. My husband always said so. The railroad's planning a line through that corridor, Ethan said. It's not public yet, but I heard it from a man at the land office last spring. Whoever holds clear title to properties along that water route stands to sell it to the railroad, Clara finished. Her voice was barely above a whisper. For how much? Enough to matter. She stood very still for a long moment, and then something changed in her face, not breaking, nothing like breaking. It was more like a shift from one kind of endurance to another, from surviving to understanding. He destroyed my life, she said, for a land deal. We don't know. He destroyed my life, she said again. And this time the words were hard and sure as iron. For a land deal with a railroad that isn't even public yet. That's why the note got sold. That's why the bank pressed so hard. That's why there was suddenly no room at Joseph's, and he needed to be rid of me before I could ask questions. She breathed out slowly. He thought if I was sold off the road and driven out of the territory, I'd be gone. I'd disappear. A woman with no resources and no family who'd claim her, who would come looking. Ethan said nothing. Because she was right, and saying so seemed inadequate. What do you need? She asked. What, to prove it? What do you need? He'd been thinking about this since last night, and the answer was both simple and complicated. The original note. The documentation of the second transfer when the debt was sold to Caldwell. If we can show the sale was improper, or that there was fraud in the original lending, the bank in Omaha, she said. The bank in Omaha. I need to write a letter, she said. Today. Can I use the telegraph office? We can try. Mrs. Pearson, who had been showing some pointed interest in the far end of her counter, appeared at Clara's elbow with a piece of paper and a pencil. She set them on the counter without comment, met Clara's eyes for one brief moment, and turned away again. Clara looked down at the paper. Then she picked up the pencil and began to write. Ethan watched her hand move across the page, quick and precise. The hand of a woman who had kept her own accounts and knew how to construct a formal request. What to ask for, how to ask for it, what language would be taken seriously. He thought about what she'd told him the night before. That she'd managed a household, managed accounts, managed more than her husband had probably understood she was managing. You did the books, he said. She didn't look up. What? For the farm, you kept the financial records. She paused in her writing. Yes. Why, so you know exactly what those accounts looked like. She looked up now. Her eyes were very sharp. I know what they looked like when I kept them, she said slowly. And I know what they looked like when the bank showed them to me after Thomas died. A pause. They were not the same. The silence between them was very loud. They changed the records, she said, or they used false ones. I couldn't prove it at the time because I didn't know to look, and I was... She stopped. I was grieving. I wasn't thinking about evidence. I was thinking about surviving the next day. But you remember what the real numbers were. I remember everything, she said quietly. Down to the last cent. He held her gaze. Write the letter, he said. All of it. Everything you remember. She looked at him for a moment, and in her face he saw something he recognized, the specific expression of someone who has been fighting alone for so long that being offered help from a direction they didn't expect doesn't compute immediately. It takes a second to process, to believe. Then she looked down and kept writing. They sent the telegram from the telegraph office 2 doors down, and the operator, a young man who made a visible effort not to look too interested, took their message with a professional neutrality that Ethan appreciated. They walked back to the wagon, and Clara climbed up without assistance, this time smoothly, like she'd been doing it for years. How long for a response? She asked. Few days, maybe a week. She nodded, adjusted her skirt, then said, without looking at him, Mrs. Pearson gave me the paper without being asked. I noticed. I wasn't sure she would. She's fair, he said again. Like I told you. You have good people around you. He gathered the reins. Most of them, yeah. They were halfway back to the ranch when Clara said, I'm going to need to learn to ride. He glanced at her. If something happens, she said practically, I can't be stranded at the ranch because I can't get a horse moving, so I need to learn. All right. Can you teach me? Can. Yes? She nodded like that was settled. Then, Ethan. Yeah. Thank you. For today. For coming into town with me, instead of telling me to stay out of sight until things quieted down. He kept his eyes on the road. Hiding from a lie is the same as saying it's true. A beat. That's what I said, she replied. I know, he said. I meant it when you said it. Something passed between them in that moment. Not words. Not even a look. Just a shift in the air between two people who have said, without quite saying it, that they are standing in the same place. That they have without quite deciding to end it up on the same side. They didn't talk much for the rest of the ride, but the silence was different than it had been that morning. It had changed in the specific way that silences change between people who are beginning. Only beginning cautiously with full awareness of all the reasons for caution to trust. Back at the ranch, the day moved the way working days did, with its own rhythm and demands that didn't wait on anyone's feelings. Tom needed help with a fence section on the east boundary that had come down in the wind the night before. Will needed direction on the cattle rotation. There was a loose shoe on one of the workhorses that needed seeing to. Ethan worked through it all, and at some point in the afternoon, he noticed that Clara had come out to the kitchen garden and was pulling at the overgrowth methodically, not asking permission, not announcing what she was doing, just doing it, pulling weeds and dead growth and the sprawling mess of 3 years of neglect, clearing ground to see what was still living underneath. He paused in the yard and watched her. Tom came up beside him, following his line of sight. Good worker, Tom said quietly. Yeah. She's not what the town's saying. No, Ethan said. She's not. Tom was quiet for a moment. Then, boss, Greer was in town this morning, before you got there, talking to Elias Cook and some of the other landowners. Ethan turned to look at him. About what? About you. About whether the territory could afford to have men who gave shelter to people with, I don't know the exact words, doubtful associations maybe, something like that. Tom turned his hat in his hands. Cook didn't bite, I heard, but some of the others were listening. Ethan looked back at Clara on her knees in the kitchen garden, working through the mess with steady hands. How many? He asked. 3, maybe 4 men. Small landowners. The kind who owe favors to Caldwell for one reason or another. All right. He was quiet for a moment. Thanks, Tom. What do you want to do? Keep working, he said. Same as always. He went back to the fence repair, and the afternoon wore on, and the sun moved toward the west, and somewhere in that ordinary passage of time, something was shifting. He could feel it, the way you can feel weather coming before you can see it, the way the air changes. After supper, which was rabbit stew that Clara made from 2 rabbits, Will had caught that morning. They sat on the porch in the cooling evening. Ethan in one chair, Clara in another. A space between them that was appropriate and also somehow not uncomfortable. Clara said, "Tell me about your wife." He looked at her. "What made you ask that?" "The kitchen garden," she said. "Someone cared about it once. The way it was laid out, the varieties chosen, someone put thought into it, and you haven't touched it in what looks like 3 years." He was quiet for a moment. "Margaret," he said. "Her name was Margaret. She grew up in Virginia and came out here and never once complained about the difference. She just adapted, fixed what needed fixing." He paused. "She would have had opinions about you. Good ones or bad ones?" "Good ones," he said. "She would have taken one look at you on that road and had things to say that would have made those men feel smaller than they were." He almost smiled. "She had a gift for that." "What happened to your son?" The smile went away. "James, he was 4. A long pause. "They both went in the same week. Fever moved through the territory that winter, took a lot of people. I was in Billings for supplies when it started." His hands rested on the arms of the chair, very still. "I didn't make it back in time." Clara said nothing for a moment, then quietly, "That's the kind of thing a person carries without ever putting it down." "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what it is." The night sounds had started: insects, a distant owl, the shuffle of horses in the barn. Clara was looking at the sky, and the last of the evening light was on her profile, and Ethan thought she looked like someone who had walked through fire and come out the other side, not unburned, but unbroken, which was different from unburned and in some ways more interesting. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah." "Someone's on the road." He looked where she was looking. A lantern moving through the dark toward the ranch gate. Moving with purpose. He was on his feet before he decided to stand. The rider came through the gate without being invited, and in the lantern light, Ethan recognized him. Elias Cook, who ran the small spread 2 miles east, and had lived in this territory for 15 years and was on balance a decent man. But his face tonight was not the face of a decent man on a neighborly visit. "Walker," he said, reining in his horse, "I'm going to say this plain, and you can do with it what you want. Caldwell called a meeting tonight, at the saloon. Men are saying—" He stopped, glanced at Clara, then back at Ethan. "They're saying you've taken in someone who's got legal trouble following her. That harboring her makes you liable. That if you won't send her away, the community can't stand behind you when things come to a head between you and Caldwell." Ethan waited until Cook had finished. Then he said, "And what do you say, Elias?" Cook was quiet for a moment. "I say Caldwell's been moving on people in this territory for years, and none of us have pushed back," he said. "And I'm not sure what that makes us." He looked at Clara. "Ma'am, I can't speak for the town. I'm sorry for that." Clara looked up at him from the porch. "How many men were at that meeting?" Cook hesitated. "Maybe 12. "And how many listened to what he said?" "Most of them." She nodded slowly. "Did any of them ask who was making the accusations about me, where the information came from?" "A couple." "What did Caldwell say?" "Said it came from reliable sources. Didn't name them." Clara stood up from her chair. She stood at the edge of the porch in the dark, and her voice was completely level, and she said, "Mr. Cook, my name is Clara Whitmore. My husband, Thomas Whitmore, died 2 years ago in Nebraska and left debts I had no knowledge of. I have reason to believe those debts were fraudulently manipulated by a man whose name you would recognize in order to steal my family's land. I have nothing. I have no money, no property, and no family who will stand for me. I have only the truth and a letter I sent today to a bank in Omaha that may prove that truth in writing." She paused. "I am not asking for anything from this town, but I want you to know what you're turning your back on, so you can make that choice with open eyes." Cook looked at her for a long time. "Who's the man?" he said finally. Clara held his gaze. "Caldwell," she said. The name sat in the darkness between them, enormous and quiet, like a stone dropped into deep water. Cook's jaw tightened. Then he looked at Ethan. "You believe her?" "I do," Ethan said. Another long pause. Then Cook turned his horse. "I can't promise anything," he said. "I got my own land to protect. My own family." "I know," Ethan said. Cook rode away into the dark. The lantern light moved down the road and disappeared. Ethan and Clara stood on the porch and listened to the silence he left behind. "He'll think about it," Clara said. "Maybe." "He came here," she said. "He didn't have to come here. He could have just not told you." She looked at the empty road. "He came because some part of him knows this is wrong, and he needed to say it out loud to someone who would hear it." Ethan looked at her. "How do you know that?" "Because I know what it looks like when someone is trying to decide who they're going to be," she said quietly. "I've been doing it myself." He didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer that wouldn't say too much or not enough. After a moment, she went inside. He heard her moving in the kitchen, the soft sound of the latch on her door. He stayed on the porch for a long time looking at the dark road. Caldwell had made his move. Not a direct one that wasn't his style. He worked through reputation, through rumor, through the slow suffocation of a community's support. He wanted Clara driven out before she could ask questions. He wanted Ethan isolated before he could stand behind her, and the response to that couldn't be patience. The response to that had to be faster than Caldwell expected, from a man who'd spent 3 years standing still. Ethan went inside and lit the lamp at the kitchen table. He had letters of his own to write. The letters Ethan wrote that night were not angry letters. He had learned in his years of Army scouting, and then in the longer and quieter years of building a ranch from raw ground, that angry letters accomplished nothing except to give the recipient evidence of your state of mind. The letters he wrote were precise. They named dates, named transactions, named the specific sequence of events that had led a woman to end up bound on a road in the Montana summer heat. He wrote to the land office in Billings. He wrote to the territorial marshal's office. He wrote to a lawyer in Helena named Garrett Hines, who had handled a boundary dispute for him 4 years ago, and who Ethan trusted to be both competent and discreet. He sealed them before midnight and left them on the kitchen table to go out with Tom in the morning. Then he sat in the dark kitchen for a while longer and thought about what came next. Caldwell wouldn't wait. That was the thing about men like Nathan Caldwell. They had enough resources that waiting cost them nothing, but they had enough arrogance that they rarely chose to. He had started with rumors and social pressure, which was his usual opening move. When that didn't work, and Ethan intended to make sure it didn't work, he would escalate. The question was how and how fast. Ethan went to bed around 1 in the morning and was up again at 5. Clara was already in the kitchen. He stopped in the doorway. She was sitting at the table with a piece of paper and a pencil, and she was writing in the focused way she had, slightly forward, left hand flat on the table pencil, moving quickly and precisely. She had her hair down, not yet pinned for the day, and she looked younger like that and more tired, and he had the sense that she had not slept much more than he had. She looked up when he came in. "I'm writing down everything I remember," she said. "About the accounts. Every figure, every transaction I recorded in the farm ledger. Everything Thomas told me, and everything he didn't tell me, but that I found in his papers after he died." She looked back at the paper. "You said the bank would have records, but records can be altered. My memory can't be." Ethan poured 2 cups of coffee and set one beside her without comment. "How far back does your memory go?" he asked. "The day Thomas and I married," she said. "He had $40 and a mule, and I had a sewing kit and a recipe box. I know what we had, and I know what we built, and I know what was there when I last looked at those books a week before he died." She paused. "And I know it didn't add up to the number the bank showed me." "By how much?" She looked up. $800. The number sat between them. $800 in false debt, Ethan said. "At least. There may have been more I didn't catch because I didn't know to look for it." She picked up her coffee with her left hand, kept writing with her right. "I was a farmer's wife, looking at what I thought was a straightforward account. I wasn't looking for fraud. If I had been—" She stopped. "If I had been, I would have found it." He believed her. He sat down at the table across from her and drank his coffee and watched her write. And there was something in the ordinariness of that moment. Two people at a kitchen table in the early morning. The light coming gray through the window. The sound of the ranch waking up outside that felt in its very ordinariness, like something fragile and worth protecting. Tom came in at 5:30 and took the letters without asking questions, which was another thing Ethan valued about him. He was gone before the sun was fully up. The morning passed in work. Clara had asked to start riding lessons, and Ethan didn't see any reason to delay. So after the morning chores were done, he brought out a gentle mare named Sunday, 15 years old, patient as a saint, who had taught more than one person to ride without complaint, and they spent an hour in the paddock. Clara was not a natural rider. She was too stiff at first fighting the movement, instead of going with it the way people do when they're trying to control something they don't yet understand. She fell off twice. Both times she got up without comment, dusted herself off, and got back on. "You don't have to look like that," she said after the second fall. "Like what?" "Like you're trying not to say something." "I'm not trying not to say something. You were going to tell me to relax," she said, climbing back into the saddle. "I was going to suggest you stop fighting Sunday and start listening to her," he said. "Different thing." Clara looked down at the mare's neck. "What am I listening for? The way she shifts her weight. She'll tell you what she's about to do before she does it if you're paying attention." He came to stand beside Sunday and put one hand on the mare's neck. "Put your hand here." She put her hand there. "Feel that?" A pause. Then slowly something changed in Clara's posture, a subtle release, a softening through the shoulders. "She's breathing," Clara said. "You were holding your breath," he said. She felt it. She goes stiff when her rider's stiff. He stepped back. "Try again." She tried again. By the end of the hour, she was managing a slow walk around the paddock without fighting Sunday for every step, and the set of her jaw had moved from determined to something closer to concentrated. It wasn't mastery, but it was the beginning of understanding, which was more useful than mastery without understanding. When she dismounted, she stood for a moment with her hand on Sunday's neck. "Thank you," she said to the horse. Sunday bumped her with a soft nose. Ethan took the mare back to the barn, and when he came out, Clara was standing at the paddock fence looking at the road. Her posture had changed. The concentration had gone and been replaced by something else tense, watchful. "Rider," she said. He looked. A man on a gray horse coming from the direction of town, moving at a canter, which meant either urgency or someone who wanted to look urgent. He didn't recognize the horse, but when the rider got close enough, he recognized the face, young, sharp-featured, with the particular look of someone who has been sent to deliver a message and is aware that the message isn't welcome. The rider reined in at the fence. "Mr. Walker," he said. "Message from Mr. Caldwell." He pulled a folded paper from his coat and held it out. Ethan took it, opened it. The handwriting was neat, almost formal. The handwriting of a man who had gone to some pains to be educated and liked to display that fact. The message itself was 4 sentences. It informed Ethan that Nathan Caldwell was aware of certain inquiries being made regarding land transactions in the Nebraska Territory. That these inquiries were based on the unreliable claims of a woman of questionable standing. That Caldwell would be in Millhaven on Friday and expected to discuss the matter directly, and that it would be in everyone's best interest if the relevant party had been relocated before that conversation took place. Ethan read it twice, Then he folded it and put it in his pocket. "Tell Mr. Caldwell I received his message," he said to the rider. The young man hesitated. "And that's all." The rider looked uncertain, then turned his horse and went back the way he'd come. Clara was at Ethan's elbow. "What did it say?" He took the letter out and handed it to her. She read it. He watched her face while she read it, watched the careful control, watched the single moment where something moved behind her eyes and was suppressed. She handed it back. "Friday," she said. 3 days. "And he wants me gone by then." "That's what he wants," Ethan said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What he's saying about me being of questionable standing, that's going to be what he leads with on Friday. He'll have constructed something, a narrative, something that sounds official." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were working through it fast. "He has resources I don't. He can make paper say whatever he wants." "He can make paper say a lot of things," Ethan agreed. "But paper that contradicts what a bank in Omaha has in its actual records. We haven't heard from the bank yet." "No, we haven't." He looked at her. "But you have your numbers." "My word against his documentation." "Your word and his documentation," he said, "in front of the right people. A territorial judge, a federal land officer, someone outside his reach." Clara looked at him steadily. "He'll come to that meeting on Friday with a room full of men who owe him, and you'll be standing there with a woman no one in this territory knows who came off a dusty road 6 days ago with nothing but a torn dress and a story." "7 days," he said, "and yes." "That doesn't concern you." "It concerns me," he said, "but concern isn't the same as doubt." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something he hadn't seen her do, yet she looked away first. Looked at her hands at the fence rail at Sunday moving slowly in the paddock. And the look on her face was the specific look of a person who has been offered something they are afraid to accept, because every time they have accepted something offered in good faith, it has come apart in their hands. He understood that look. He knew it from the inside. "Clara," he said. She looked back at him. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. Simply. Just that. "I'm not going to be somewhere else on Friday. I'm not going to decide this isn't my business. I'm not going to change my mind about what I know to be true because Caldwell sends a polite letter with a threat in it." She held his gaze for a long time. "Why?" she said, quietly. "Because you've been alone in this long enough," he said, "and because it's wrong. And because—" He stopped. He hadn't intended to say the next part, but it came anyway in that way that things came when you were more tired than usual and your guard was down. "Because my wife would have been ashamed of me if I'd ridden past you on that road. And I've spent 3 years trying to be someone she wouldn't be ashamed of." The silence that followed was not an uncomfortable one. "She sounds like someone worth being true to," Clara said finally. "She was," he said. They went in for noon dinner, and the afternoon moved fast, and by late afternoon, something had shifted in the rhythm of the ranch, a tightening, a sense of things converging that both Tom and Will felt without being told about the letter. Tom found Ethan in the barn. "Greer was in town again," Tom said, "talking to the men who run the livery and the hardware, saying there's going to be a community meeting on Friday night, official-like, about land use and water rights." He paused. "He's building an audience." "I know. He's framing it so it looks like a regular town meeting, but the agenda's going to be about you." Tom was quiet for a second. "And Miss Whitmore." "I know that too." "What do we do?" Ethan thought about the letters he'd sent, about the telegram from the bank that might or might not arrive before Friday, about a woman in his kitchen who remembered numbers down to the last cent, and had the spine of someone who had survived things that would have broken most people he knew. "We go to the meeting," he said. Tom blinked. "We go. All of us. Including Miss Whitmore." "Especially Miss Whitmore." Tom was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "Caldwell's going to have 10 men for every one of ours." "Probably." And the town's been listening to his people for a week. Yes. And we're going to walk in there anyway. Yes, Ethan said. That's exactly what we're going to do. Tom looked at him for a long moment. Then he put his hat back on. All right, boss, he said. All right. He found Clara in the kitchen after supper and told her. She stopped what she was doing, turned to face him. You want me to walk into a room full of people who've already decided who I am, she said. Yes. And say what? The truth, he said. Your version. In your words, not his. She was quiet for a long moment. They won't believe me, she said. Not over him. Not at first. Maybe not, he said. But there's a difference between people who don't believe you and people who've never heard you. Right now, all they've heard is his version. You haven't been in that room. You haven't spoken. He paused. A lie that goes unanswered starts to feel like truth. But a lie that's answered starts to feel like a lie, she said slowly. That's all we need. That's all I'm asking for. She looked at him for a long time. Something was moving through her face, complicated and layered the look of a woman doing very rapid arithmetic on odds that weren't good and deciding anyway. I'll need a better dress, she said. He blinked. I have one, she said quickly. In my bag. I've been saving it. She looked down at the kitchen gray dress. I'm not walking into that room looking like someone who came off the road. I'm walking in like someone who belongs there. He almost smiled. Yes, ma'am. Don't, she said. Don't call me ma'am when you're almost smiling. It's condescending. This time he did smile. Couldn't help it. All right. She turned back to the stove and he turned to go and she said without turning around, Ethan? Yeah. Whatever happens Friday. Whatever they say or he says. A pause. I want you to know that even if it goes wrong, I'm glad you stopped on that road. He stood in the doorway for a moment. So am I, he said. Wednesday brought a visitor Ethan had not expected. Ruth Henderson came up the ranch road in the early afternoon, driving her own wagon, a small upright woman of 55 with gray hair and bright eyes, and the particular energy of someone who has decided to do something and is doing it before she talks herself out of it. She pulled up in the yard and climbed down without waiting for help. Ethan Walker. She said, I am not here to start trouble, and I am not here to take sides in anything I don't understand. I am here because my neighbor has a woman staying with him, and I have not called on her, and that is bad manners, and I don't hold with bad manners. Ethan looked at her. Good morning, Ruth. Is she here? Kitchen, most likely. Ruth Henderson marched to the kitchen door and knocked on it with the confidence of a woman who has never found a door she couldn't knock on. Clara opened it. The two women looked at each other. Clara Whitmore, Ruth said. I'm Ruth Henderson. I live 4 miles east. I've brought you a pie and some information, and you can decide which one you find more useful. Clara stepped back to let her in. Please come in, Mrs. Henderson. Ethan stayed on the porch. Some conversations were better had without a man in the room, and he had learned to recognize them. Ruth Henderson stayed for 2 hours. When she came out, her expression was different from when she'd gone and thoughtful. Set the expression of a woman who has had her suspicions confirmed and is deciding what to do about them. She's a good woman, Ruth said to Ethan. Yes, he said. She is. Caldwell's been spreading lies. It wasn't a question. Yes. Ruth looked at him directly. You know what he did to the McCready family 3 years ago. I know. And the Blaine family before that. She pulled on her gloves. He's been doing this for years and nobody's stopped him because nobody's been in a position to stop him. He's always picked people who were alone. She looked back at the kitchen door. She's not alone now. No, Ethan said. She's not. Ruth climbed back into her wagon. I'll be at that meeting on Friday. And I'll be bringing my sister-in-law, who has the loudest voice in Millhaven and very strong opinions about men who steal from widows. She gathered her reins. Good afternoon, Ethan. Good afternoon, Ruth. He watched her wagon roll away and felt for the first time in several days something that edged toward cautious. Thursday morning the telegram came. Tom rode in from town at a gallop, which he never did unless it was urgent, and came into the barn where Ethan was working with his horse pulled up short and his face doing something complicated. "From the bank," Tom said, holding out the yellow paper. Ethan took it. The telegram was brief the way telegrams were. It confirmed that the Whitmore farm account had been transferred to a secondary lender name on file in a transaction dated 8 months after Thomas Whitmore's death. It further noted in the careful language of a bank trying to be accurate without being liable that there appeared to be a discrepancy between the original loan documentation and the transfer documentation, and that a full review had been initiated. The name of the secondary lender was Nathan Caldwell, doing business through a land investment company registered in Cheyenne. Ethan read it twice. Then he walked to the house. Clara was in the kitchen. She turned when he came in, read his face before he said a word, and put down what she was holding. He gave her the telegram. She read it. He watched her face while she read it, watched the absolute stillness that came over her, the way her breathing changed, the way her hands tightened on the paper, and then deliberately relaxed. She read it again. Then she set it very carefully on the table, the way you set down something you need to keep in sight, because if you look away from it, you might not believe it's real. 8 months after Thomas died, she said. Yes, he waited 8 months. Her voice was very controlled. He waited until I was settled in Nebraska, until I thought it was over, until I was beginning to think I might be able to manage, and then he made his move. She pressed one hand flat on the table beside the telegram. He timed it. He knew exactly when to apply the pressure, and he timed it so I had the least possible ability to fight back. Yes, Ethan said. He was watching us. Her voice didn't rise, didn't crack. It went harder and quieter, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. For years, maybe. Watching the property. Watching the water rights along the North Creek. Waiting for the right moment to... She stopped. Thomas didn't borrow $800 extra. Caldwell created that debt, on paper, after Thomas was already dead and couldn't contradict it. The bank's review will confirm that. The bank's review will take months. She looked at him. Friday is tomorrow night. I know. This telegram is not enough, not by itself, not for a room full of people who don't want to believe it. It's enough to show that there's a question, he said, a real one, official, from a bank in another territory. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. It's enough to shift the ground under his story. He's been presenting this as settled, as clear as a situation where the facts are already known and you're the problem. This puts the facts in question. Clara looked at the telegram for a long moment. He's going to have an answer for it, she said. He's resourceful. He'll have an answer. Probably. I need to be ready for the answer. Then let's think about what it might be. They spent the rest of the afternoon doing exactly that, sitting at the kitchen table with the telegram between them and a piece of paper where Ethan wrote down every counter-argument Caldwell might make, and Clara thought through the response to each one with the systematic precision of someone who had spent 2 years going over the facts of her own disaster and knew them forward and backward. Will came in at one point for something and stopped in the doorway at the sight of them, the table covered in paper, both of them leaning forward, talking in the focused shorthand of people working a problem together, and quietly reversed out of the doorway without disturbing them. By evening, they had something, not a legal brief, not a courtroom argument, but a clear, plain account of what had happened, and in what order, supported by the telegram, supported by Clara's documented memory of the accounts, with every foreseeable challenge anticipated and answered. After supper, Clara read it back to him once out loud from the beginning. Her voice was steady throughout. Precise. Controlled. The voice of a woman presenting evidence, not asking for sympathy. When she finished, she put the paper down. Well, she said. I believe every word of it, he said. You already believed me. Yes. But I believe it differently now than I did before. He looked at her across the table. You could walk into a federal court with that account and stand behind it. Something shifted in her face. Do you think it'll come to that? Might. If it does, she stopped. If it goes that far, Ethan, it means real legal proceedings. Testimony. My name in territorial records as the person who brought action against Nathan Caldwell. She looked at him steadily. That kind of thing follows a person. It follows the truth too, he said. And the truth tends to outlast the noise. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I want to be done being afraid. I've been afraid for 2 years. I'm tired of it. Then be done with it, he said simply. She looked at him. It's not that easy. No, he said. But sometimes deciding is the hardest part. Friday arrived the way days of reckoning always do, with the deceptive normalcy of an ordinary morning. The sun came up the same as always. The horses needed feeding the same as always. Tom burned the first batch of biscuits trying to help with breakfast, which had never not happened in the 3 months he'd been working for Ethan. Clara came down dressed in the good dress. It was dark green, well made, with none of the frontier's dust on it, because she had kept it wrapped and protected through everything. She wore it with her hair up and her chin level, and the look on her face of someone who has chosen their ground and is standing on it. Tom looked at her and forgot what he'd been about to say. Will said, You look fine, Miss Whitmore. Thank you, Will, she said, and poured her coffee. Ethan said nothing. He didn't need to. She already knew. They rode into town in the wagon, all 4 of them, Ethan and Clara on the bench, Tom and Will in the back, the telegram and the written account in Ethan's coat pocket. The evening air was cooling and the sky was going orange above the hills, and the town was visible from a mile out, its lights coming on one by one against the dusk. Clara watched the lights come on. How many people do you think will be there? She asked. Most of the town, he said. Caldwell's good at making things feel like civic events. And most of them will be against us. At the start. Ethan. She said his name with a particular weight. If this doesn't work, if they've already made up their minds. We still say it, he said. Even if they've decided, we say it anyway. She nodded slowly. Because a lie that goes unanswered feels like truth, he finished. They came into town. The saloon, the largest indoor space in Millhaven, was already full when they arrived. Ethan could see it through the windows as they pulled up the crowd of men inside the orange lamplight, the particular shape of a room where people have come to witness something. He climbed down from the wagon and offered his hand to Clara. She took it, stepped down, looked at the saloon door. Ready? He asked. No, she said. Good, he said. Means you're taking it seriously. She looked at him sideways. Then she straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and walked toward the door. He walked beside her. When they came through the door, the room changed. It didn't go silent. It went that particular way of a crowd that has been talking and then redirects all its attention without the talking quite stopping. So there's a sound like a wave turning around itself. Heads turned. The conversations went lower, faster, more pointed. Ethan kept walking. Clara kept walking. Nathan Caldwell was at the front of the room, standing beside a table where papers were spread out. He was a large man in his 50s, silver-haired, well-dressed in the way of a man who wanted you to see the money in his clothes without it looking like he was trying. He had the face of someone who had been handsome 20 years ago and had since acquired the particular solidity of a man who had not been told no for a very long time. He looked up when Ethan and Clara came in. His expression didn't change, which was its own kind of answer. Greer was beside him, and Greer's expression changed very slightly. A flicker of something that wasn't quite surprise, which meant he had expected them to come and was still slightly wrong-footed by it. Ethan moved through the crowd toward the front. People stepped aside. Not dramatically, not ostentatiously, but they stepped aside, and he noted who stepped aside easily, and who took a moment to decide. Elias Cook near the back met his eyes briefly, and gave the smallest possible nod. Ruth Henderson was in the middle of the room, solid as a fence post, with a woman beside her that Ethan had never seen, but assumed was the sister-in-law with the loud voice. Caldwell spoke before Ethan reached the front. Walker. His voice was pleasant, carrying the voice of a man comfortable addressing rooms. Glad you could join us, though I want to make clear that what we're discussing tonight is a matter of community interest and not an appropriate venue for, he looked at Clara, personal grievances. Is that what we're calling land fraud now? Ethan said. The room went sharp and still. Caldwell's expression stayed even. That's a serious accusation. Yes, Ethan said. It is. He took the telegram from his coat pocket. Received this yesterday, from Mercantile Bank of Omaha, regarding a land transaction in Nebraska, specifically a second mortgage loan on the Whitmore farm property that was sold to a secondary lender 8 months after Thomas Whitmore's death. The secondary lender's name is Nathan Caldwell, doing business as Cheyenne Land Investments. He held the telegram up. That's not a personal grievance. That's a record. The room was very quiet. Caldwell looked at the telegram, at Ethan, at Clara. His expression was controlled in the way of a man who has played enough high-stakes hands to keep his face still when the cards go wrong. A telegram from a bank, he said carefully, is not evidence of fraud. No, Ethan said, but a bank review citing discrepancies between original loan documentation and transfer documentation is a beginning. He looked at him. How much is the railroad paying per acre along the North Creek corridor, Nathan? What's the figure? Because a woman lost her home and her future and ended up bound on a road in the summer heat, and I'd like to know what that was worth to you. The silence in the room had a different quality now, and that was when Clara stepped forward. She stepped forward from beside Ethan 1 step, so she was no longer behind him, but beside him, and she said in a voice that was clear and steady, and carried to every corner of that room without effort. My name is Clara Whitmore. My husband, Thomas Whitmore, died in Nebraska in the autumn of 1880. We had no debt I knew of, beyond our original mortgage, which was current. After my husband's death, I was presented with documentation of a second loan I had never seen and never signed. I was given 30 days to vacate my home. She paused. I kept my husband's accounts. I know what was in those ledgers, and I know what was not. And what was not in those ledgers was $800 of additional debt. She looked at Caldwell directly. You waited 8 months. Until I was settled, until I thought it was over, until I had stopped looking over my shoulder. And then you applied pressure through a bank in another territory and took a piece of land you'd been watching for years because a railroad was coming and you wanted the water rights. Caldwell said nothing. You then arranged, Clara continued, through means I am still documenting to ensure that when I ended up in this territory, I arrived with no resources, no reputation, and no one to speak for me, so that I couldn't ask questions, and I couldn't be believed if I did. She stopped. The room was absolutely silent. Caldwell looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, This woman came off a road with nothing. You have no proof. She has the bank telegram, Ruth Henderson said from the middle of the room, which she just told you about. And she has a woman who can read accounts, said the sister-in-law, whose voice was in fact extremely loud, and who kept her own books and knows when numbers don't add up. She has a lawyer in Helena, Ethan said, named Garrett Hines, who received a letter 3 days ago with the full account of the transaction and has been asked to advise on the appropriate legal proceedings. He had not actually confirmed that Hines had written back. He had sent the letter. That was true. What Hines had done with it was something he'd find out when he found out. But what he said was also true. Hines had received the letter. That was enough for now. Caldwell's jaw moved. You're making a serious mistake, he said. His voice had lost the pleasant quality. Both of you. Maybe, Ethan said. But here's what I know about mistakes, Nathan. A mistake you make standing up for what's right is better than a comfortable position you built on someone else's ruin. He looked at him steadily. She's not going anywhere. I'm not going anywhere. And every person in this room has now heard what I've said, and what she said, and they're going to have to decide for themselves what they think about it. He looked around the room. At the faces, some of them hostile, some of them uncertain, some of them very carefully not showing anything at all. "That's all I'm asking," he said. "Think about it. Think about the McCready family while you're at it, and the Blaine family, and whoever comes next if this is allowed to continue." Caldwell said very quietly, "You'll regret this, Walker." "Maybe," Ethan said again, "but not tonight." He turned to Clara. She was still standing beside him, still straight, still with that level chin, and her eyes were very bright, not with tears, but with something else, something that had a name he couldn't quite say yet in a room full of people. "Ready to go?" he said. She looked at him. "Not quite," she said. She turned back to the room, to the crowd of people who had been assembled to witness her defeat, and she said calmly and clearly, "If anyone in this room has had a land transaction with Nathan Caldwell that felt wrong to them, that didn't add up, that moved faster or different than expected, I would like to hear about it. You can find me at Walker Ranch. I'm not hiding, and I'm not leaving." She paused. "And whatever he's told you about me, I am asking you to wait until you've heard my side before you decide. That's all I ask. Just wait." She looked at Caldwell one last time. "Thank you for holding this meeting," she said to him with a courtesy so precise it was almost a weapon. "You gave me the room I needed." Then she turned and walked toward the door, and Ethan walked beside her. And behind them, the room broke open into the sound of a crowd that has just seen something it didn't expect and doesn't quite know what to do with it. They didn't speak until they were in the wagon, and the lights of the saloon were a block behind them. Then Tom said from the back in a voice of pure reverence, "Miss Whitmore, that was—" "Don't," she said. "I was going to say incredible." "I know what you were going to say." She was looking at her hands, which were shaking very slightly for the first time since Ethan had known her. "I'd like a moment, please." They rode in silence. Ethan didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the road. But after a while in the dark, her shoulder came to rest against his, and she didn't pull it back, and he didn't move away. They rode the rest of the way home like that, and behind them in Mill Haven, in a saloon full of people who had come expecting to witness a conclusion, something else had started. Something quieter and more stubborn than a crowd. Something that moved from person to person in the particular way that truth moves when it has finally been allowed in the room. Nathan Caldwell stood at the front of that room and felt it move, and for the first time in a very long time, he was not entirely certain he was the most powerful person in it. Nobody slept well that night. Ethan knew this because he was awake at 3 a.m, hearing Clara move in the kitchen, the soft sound of the water pitcher, the creak of the chair, and he lay still in the dark and listened to the small sounds of another person existing in his house, and he thought about all the ways the night could have gone differently, and hadn't. He was up at 5. Clara was already at the table with her account papers spread around her, a cup of cold coffee at her elbow that she'd clearly forgotten about her pencil moving. "You need to sleep," he said. "I slept," she said without looking up. "When?" "For a while." She paused in her writing. "Elias Cook came to you before the meeting. He warned you about what Caldwell was planning." "Yes. He was at the saloon last night. He didn't say anything either way during what happened." She looked up. "But he didn't leave either. He stayed the whole time, and he listened." "I noticed." "He's going to have to decide," she said. "And I think he's going to decide right. But he needs a reason that protects him. A practical reason, not just a moral one." She turned her pencil over in her fingers. "Does he have a land transaction with Caldwell?" Anything that could be questioned. Ethan thought about it. He borrowed against his east pasture 4 years ago. Caldwell held the note for a year before selling it to the Territory Bank. Clara's eyes sharpened. "Why did Caldwell sell it?" "Cook's land doesn't border the water corridor," he said slowly. "No railroad value. So Caldwell kept the notes that mattered and sold the ones that didn't." She set her pencil down. "Which means there are probably men in that room last night who still have notes held by Caldwell. Notes he's kept because he wants the underlying property." She looked at Ethan directly. If we can identify which ones, they become witnesses, he said. Or at minimum, they stop being his. Who at the land office do you trust? Harris, he said immediately. Deputy Registrar. He's been there 12 years, and he doesn't owe Caldwell anything I know of. Then we need to talk to Harris today. Ethan picked up her cold coffee cup, poured it out, and refilled it from the pot. He set it back down in front of her. She looked at the cup, then up at him. Thank you, she said. You're going to need it, he said. It's going to be a long day. It was longer than either of them expected. They were barely through their second cup when Tom came in at a half-run from the direction of the road, his hat in his hand, and his face doing the complicated thing again. Ryder, he said. Two of them. Coming fast. Ethan was on his feet before Tom finished the sentence. The two riders came through the gate without slowing, and Ethan recognized one of them, a young man named Dale Pritchard, who worked at the telegraph office and sometimes carried messages when the situation was urgent enough to pay for the speed. The other was a stranger, older, with the look of a man who'd been traveling hard and long. Mr. Walker, Pritchard said, pulling up. This man came in on the night stage from Helena. Asked for you by name. The older man climbed down from his horse with the stiffness of someone who'd been riding for hours and was past caring about looking smooth about it. He was perhaps 60, gray-bearded, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of unhurried authority that Ethan recognized as belonging to men who spent their lives in rooms where decisions had weight. Garrett Hines, the man said, extending his hand. You wrote to me. Ethan shook it. I didn't expect you in person. I was in Billings already when your letter arrived, came up on the night stage. Hines looked at the house, then at Clara, who had appeared in the doorway. His eyes moved over her with the quick professional assessment of a man who reads people for a living. Miss Whitmore. Mr. Hines, she said. I've been aware of Nathan Caldwell's activities in this territory for 2 years, Hines said without preamble. I've had 3 separate clients whose land transactions bore his signature on documents that shouldn't have had it. I couldn't move without a direct complainant who had standing and documentation. He looked between them. Your letter gave me both. Clara came down the porch steps. What can you do? She said. Directly, no preamble, the way she asked everything. Hines almost smiled. I can file for a federal review of the Whitmore land transaction. With the telegram from Mercantile Bank and your documented account of the original ledgers, I can argue fraudulent debt creation. If the bank's review confirms the discrepancy, he paused, we can pursue criminal charges. The word criminal sat in the morning air like a stone. How long? Clara asked. The review process months, a federal proceeding if it comes to that longer. He looked at her steadily. But the filing itself happens immediately. And the moment I file, Caldwell's ability to act on any of the properties he's acquired through these transactions becomes legally clouded. He can't sell. He can't transfer. He can't complete whatever arrangement he has with the railroad until the federal review clears. A pause. Which it won't. Clara was very still. He's frozen, she said. Effectively, yes. He can still operate his existing holdings, but his expansion stops. And every man in this territory who has a note held by Caldwell is going to know as of this morning that the man holding their debt is under federal scrutiny. Ethan looked at Clara. She was looking at Hines, and the expression on her face was one he hadn't quite seen before. Not relief, exactly, because it was too early for that, and not triumph because she wasn't built for that. It was more like the look of a woman who has been pushing against a wall for 2 years, and has just felt it for the first time begin to move. Come inside, she said to Hines. I'll show you what I have. They were at the kitchen table for 3 hours. Ethan sat in on the first hour, listening to Clara walk Hines through the account documentation, precise, methodical date by date, and figure by figure, and then excused himself to let them work. He had things of his own to do. He went to find Elias Cook. Cook was at his east fence when Ethan rode up doing the kind of repair work that was always waiting on a working ranch, the kind you got to when you got to it. He looked up when he heard Reckoning's hooves and straightened slowly like a man preparing for a conversation he'd been expecting. Hines is at my place, Ethan said, filing a federal review on the Caldwell transactions. Cook was quiet for a moment. Federal. Yes, that's... Cook took his hat off, ran his hand through his graying hair. That's not a small thing. No, it's not. Caldwell's going to fight it. He's going to try. Cook looked at the fence post he'd been working on. My note, he said. The one on the east pasture. Caldwell sold it to the Territory Bank, but... He stopped. There were terms in that original note that changed between when I signed it and when I got my copy back. Small things. Things I didn't push on because I didn't think I had grounds. Ethan looked at him. Tell that to Hines. A long pause. My family's on that land, Cook said. If I go against Caldwell and this doesn't hold... If you don't go, and it does hold, Ethan said, and it comes out later that you had information you didn't give, that's a different problem. Cook put his hat back on, squared it, the gesture of a man who has made a decision. I'll come this afternoon, he said. 3 more men came to Walker Ranch that afternoon without being sent for. Ethan didn't fully understand the mechanism of it, whether Ruth Henderson had talked, or whether Cook had reached out, or whether some faster and less traceable thing had happened in the way information moved through a small community when it was ready to move. But they came a rancher named Beaumont who had lost water access on his south property 2 years ago in a transaction he'd never quite understood, a small farmer named Yates, whose brother had sold land to a Caldwell company under what he now described as considerable pressure, and a woman, a widow, named Mrs. Garner, who had a stack of papers in a cloth bag and a jaw set in the same way Clara's jaw was set, and who sat down at Ethan's kitchen table and said, I've been waiting for someone to ask. Hines stayed through supper. Clara barely ate. She moved between the table and the kitchen and back again, keeping coffee made, and listening to everything with the focused absorption of a woman who was building something in her head, cross-referencing, connecting, filing. Ethan watched her and thought about what she'd said 2 years of accounts and records would look like in the hands of someone who'd been waiting to use them. After supper, when Cook and Beaumont and Yates and Mrs. Garner had gone, and Hines was organizing his papers at the table, Clara sat down across from him. All of them had the same thing, she said. Different transactions, different properties, different amounts. But the same structure, an original agreement that shifted between signing and execution. A secondary party that appeared after the fact, pressure applied at a moment of vulnerability. She looked at Hines. He has a method. Yes, Hines said. Fraud usually does. Consistency is what makes it prosecutable. He stacked his papers. I'll file Monday morning in Billings. By Tuesday, Caldwell will know. He looked at Clara. When he knows, he'll respond. I want you prepared for that. What kind of response? Legal to start. His lawyers will challenge the standing of the review. Hines's voice was matter-of-fact. They'll be thorough and they'll be expensive and they'll be very good at their jobs. He didn't get where he is by being unprepared for opposition. But the filing stands until the review, Ethan said. The filing stands. Clara nodded slowly. Then we file. Hines left at nightfall to catch the morning stage back to Billings. The house was quiet after he went. Tom and Will had gone to the bunkhouse hours ago. The kitchen table was covered in papers that Clara began to sort, stacking and organizing with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything. Ethan sat and watched her for a while. Then he said, "How are you doing?" She paused in her sorting. "Fine." Clara. She looked up at him. The control was still there. It was always there, a thing she wore like armor, and he had stopped expecting her to take it off in the middle of a working day with lawyers at the table and witnesses coming through the door. But it was evening now. The lamp was low. The house was quiet. And something in her face just slightly shifted. "I don't know how to feel about today," she said. "What do you mean?" "I mean..." She stopped, set down the papers. 2 years ago, I was standing in a bank office in Nebraska, being told my husband's debts were going to take everything. And I went home, and I sat in an empty house, and I tried to figure out what I'd done wrong, what I'd missed, why I hadn't seen it. She looked at her hands. And today, a lawyer sat at a table in a ranch in Montana and told me that what happened to me was a crime, that I didn't miss anything, that it was done to me deliberately by a man with a method. A pause. I don't know what to do with that. I've spent 2 years assuming I failed somewhere, and today someone told me I didn't. Ethan said nothing for a moment. You didn't, he said. I know that now. She pressed her fingers flat on the table, but knowing it doesn't immediately fix what the last 2 years felt like. No, he said, it doesn't. Knowing something's true and feeling the weight of it lift are two different events. The second one takes longer. She looked at him. You know that from experience. I know it from 3 years of knowing Margaret's death wasn't my fault, he said, and still waking up some mornings with the weight of it. She held his gaze for a long time. Does it get lighter? She asked. Some, he said, when there's something to hold on the other side of the scale. Something moved across her face, quiet and complicated and more honest than almost anything he'd seen from her. She looked down at her hands again. I should finish sorting these, she said. In the morning, he said. She looked up. There'll be the same papers in the morning, he said. And you've been up since 3. The case will keep. A pause. Then she exhaled, and the exhale carried something with it, not quite the armor coming off, but something loosening at the edges. All right, she said. She stood up, then stopped. Ethan. She said his name with the particular weight she used when what followed mattered. If this goes to a federal proceeding, if it gets complicated and long and loud, you understand that being involved, being the person who housed me, and brought the witnesses and had a lawyer at your table, it puts you in the center of it. I know. Your land, your reputation, your standing in this community. I know that too. I need to know you understand what that means. Before this goes any further, I need to know you're choosing it with your eyes open and not just... She stopped. Not just because you stopped on a road 2 weeks ago and it seemed like the right thing to do. He looked at her steadily. Clara, he said, I stopped on that road because it was right. Everything I've done since then has been because it was right. Those are the same reason, and it's been my reason from the beginning. He paused. That's not going to change based on how loud things get. She looked at him for a long time. Okay, she said, very quietly. Okay, he agreed. She went to her room. The latch clicked. He sat at the table for a while in the low lamplight and thought about what she'd said, the 2 years of believing she'd failed, the long weight of blame that had never belonged to her, the way it didn't lift all at once, even when you knew the truth. He understood that more than he'd said. He put out the lamp and went to bed, and this time sleep came faster. Caldwell's response came on Wednesday. Not a letter. Not a writer. 2 men arrived at the Walker Ranch gate on Wednesday morning and stood outside it without dismounting, and they were not the kind of men who came to deliver messages. They were the kind of men who were the message. Tom came to the barn where Ethan was working. 2 riders at the gate, he said in the particular voice he used when something was wrong. Don't recognize them. They're not asking to come in, just standing there. Ethan went to the gate. The 2 men were large, expressionless, and professionally patient, the kind of patient that was its own statement. Mr. Walker, one of them said, Mr. Caldwell would like you to know that the legal filing made Monday morning in Billings is being contested on the grounds of standing. His lawyers expect it to be dismissed within the week. That right? Ethan said, not a question. He'd also like you to know that he bears no ill will toward you personally, that this is a business matter, and that business matters have a way of resolving themselves more cleanly when people focus on their own concerns. The man looked past Ethan toward the house. He's prepared to be generous, to the right parties, who make the right decisions. Tell Nathan Caldwell, Ethan said, that I received his message. He turned and walked back to the house. Clara was on the porch. She'd heard. "They're going to try to get the filing dismissed," she said. "They're going to try," he agreed. "Can they?" Hines said they'd challenge standing. He expected it. He climbed the porch steps. He also said he expected the challenge to fail. The bank's initiation of a review gives us independent corroboration that's hard to argue standing on. And the generous offer? He looked at her. What generous offer? The corner of her mouth moved. Right answer. Something had shifted between them in the days since the saloon meeting. Something subtle and not quite nameable. The way a season shifts, not in one dramatic moment, but in a gradual accumulation of small changes in temperature and light, until you look up one morning and realize it's different than it was. They had not talked about it because there was too much else to talk about, and because some things needed time to settle before they could be named without breaking. But it was there, in the way he knew where she was in the house without looking, in the way she moved in the kitchen with the easy authority of someone who had stopped asking permission, in the way Sunday the mare had taken to waiting by the paddock fence in the mornings until Clara came out, which Clara pretended not to notice, and Tom found intensely amusing. On Thursday, Elias Cook rode up in the early afternoon with a look on his face that was new. 3 more men want to talk to Hines, he said. Beaumont told Harker and Harker told the Delgado brothers, and all 3 of them have documentation of transactions they want reviewed. Ethan stared at him. The Delgado brothers. Their spread is 12 miles north. Caldwell's been working further out than any of us knew, Cook said grimly. He's had men making inquiries all along the water corridor. Small transactions, notes bought here and there. Nothing that would look like a pattern unless you put them all in the same room. Which is what Hines is doing. Which is what Hines is doing. Cook pulled his hat off. Walker, I owe you an apology. Ethan looked at him. At the meeting, Cook said. I should have spoken. I knew what Caldwell was. I've known for years. I didn't speak because I had reasons that felt good in the moment. He looked at the house. She stood up in that room with nothing and told the truth. I had more than her, and I said nothing. A pause. I'm sorry for that. Tell her, Ethan said. Cook blinked. If you mean it, Ethan said, tell her, not me. Cook went to the porch where Clara was working and took his hat off and said what he'd said to Ethan. And Clara listened to him with that expression that was so careful and so controlled. And when he was done, she said, You came to the ranch before the meeting. You didn't have to do that. It wasn't enough, Cook said. It was something, she said. And something matters. She said it without accommodation, without the reflexive forgiveness that people sometimes offered, because they wanted the discomfort to be over. She said it because she meant it, and Cook seemed to understand the difference, because he nodded once and put his hat back on, and didn't try to make it into more than it was. Then, on Friday morning, exactly 1 week after the saloon meeting, a letter arrived from Hines. Ethan read it first, not because Clara couldn't, but because she was up to her elbows in bread dough, and he was the one at the table, and she looked at him over her shoulder and said, Read it out loud. He read it out loud. The challenge to the standing of the Federal Review had been denied. The bank in Omaha had submitted its preliminary findings, which confirmed a discrepancy in the transfer documentation of approximately $940, which was greater than Clara's memory of $800, meaning the fraud had gone deeper than even she had calculated. On the basis of these findings, the Federal Review was proceeding. A formal investigator from the Territorial Land Office had been assigned to the case. Nathan Caldwell's lawyers had been notified, and at the bottom of the letter in Hines's precise handwriting were 2 additional sentences. Mr. Caldwell made a direct approach to my office yesterday requesting that I withdraw from the matter. I declined. He should be considered dangerous until the federal proceeding is complete. Clara stood at the kitchen counter with flour on her hands and didn't move for a long moment. Then she said, $940. Yes, he took almost $1,000 from a dead man's account. Her voice was very controlled. From a woman who was grieving, who had no way to verify it. who came to his territory and still had no way to verify it until you stopped on a road. Yes. She looked at her hands, the flour, the bread dough waiting. I want to finish making this bread, she said, and I want to eat supper, and I want to sleep tonight. And tomorrow I want to write to the bank in Omaha and ask what the timeline is for a formal restitution claim. She turned to look at him. Is that a thing I can do? Hines would say yes, Ethan said. I'd say write to him first. All right. She looked at the letter which he'd set on the table. He's dangerous. Hines thinks so. I think so. But he's also... She paused. He's also cornered, and cornered men do the thing that cornered men do. They do, Ethan said. So we need to be careful. We do. She looked at him steadily. No heroics, Ethan. He almost smiled. I don't recall doing any heroics. You walked into a saloon full of men who were against us, she said, with a telegram in your pocket and no guarantee of anything. That wasn't heroics, he said. That was just going. She looked at him for a moment. No heroics, she said again, and turned back to the bread. Saturday brought something Ethan hadn't expected. Joseph Whitmore arrived at the ranch gate. Not with riders, not with posturing. He arrived alone in the same sad wagon with the cracked wheel, and he tied his horse to the post outside the gate and stood there hat in hand, in the particular posture of a man who has come somewhere he's not sure he'll be let in and knows he deserves that uncertainty. Tom came to find Ethan in the barn. Her brother, he said with the economy of a man who'd seen enough in the last 2 weeks to understand what that meant. Ethan went to the gate. Joseph Whitmore looked older than he had on the road. The red-faced bluster was gone. What was underneath it was tired and smaller than the bluster had made him look, and carrying something that Ethan recognized without warmth as guilt. I want to speak to Clara, Joseph said. Does she want to speak to you? I don't know. A pause. I'm asking you to ask her. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Then he went inside. Clara was at the table, writing her letter to the Omaha bank. She looked up when he came in, and he saw her read his face the way she'd learned to read it quickly, accurately. Who is it? She said. Joseph. She was still for a full 3 seconds. Then she set down her pencil. Is he alone? Yes. Is he, what does he look like? Ethan thought about it. Like a man who knows what he did. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she stood up. She went to the gate herself. Ethan followed a few steps behind, far enough to give her space, but close enough that Joseph could see him there. Brother and sister looked at each other through the gate. Joseph Whitmore turned his hat in his hands. The gesture reminded Ethan painfully of Elias Cook on the night he'd come to warn them, the same fidgeting, the same prelude to something that was hard to say. Caldwell told me you had debts, Joseph said. After Thomas died, he came to me directly, said you owed money in Nebraska and it was going to follow you, and that if I didn't want it to affect my family, I needed to separate you from us. A long pause. He came to me, Clara. He found me. He said things that... He stopped. I believed them because it was easier than thinking about what it meant that he was saying them to me at all. Clara stood very still. He used you, she said. Her voice was not angry. It was something colder and more complicated than anger. He used your fear and your resentment of me, and he built the last piece of his plan out of both. Joseph looked down. Yes. You tied my hands, she said. You put me on that road. I know what I did. Do you... She said it without heat. Because what you did, Joseph, wasn't just weakness or fear. You tied your sister's hands. You drove her to a road in the summer heat, and you sold her to strangers. A pause. Do you understand that... Yes, he said, barely audible. I need you to say you understand it, she said. Not apologize. Don't apologize yet. Just tell me you understand what you did. Joseph Whitmore looked up at his sister with the full weight of it in his face. The full, undefended weight of a man who has finally stopped making reasons for himself. "I understand what I did," he said, "and there is no excuse for it. None." The silence between them was very long. "You were also a witness," Clara said finally. "Caldwell came to you. He told you things about my situation that he couldn't have known unless he'd been watching us. Watching Thomas's accounts." She looked at him steadily. "What exactly did he say to you? Every word you can remember." Joseph blinked. A lawyer named Garrett Hines is building a federal case against Nathan Caldwell," she said. "What you know, what he told you when he told you how he found you is evidence. It shows premeditation. It shows how early he began planning this." She paused. "I'm not asking for you, Joseph. I'm asking for the case." Joseph looked at her for a long time. "You want me to testify," he said. "I want you to tell the truth," she said. "Whatever form that takes." He was quiet for a very long moment. Ethan watched him. Watched the calculus of a man weighing his own comfort against something larger, watched the moment when the scale tipped. "I'll talk to your lawyer," Joseph said. Clara opened the gate. Not wide, not warmly, just enough to let him through. "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee." Ethan walked with them to the house and listened to Joseph begin the account of how Caldwell had found him and what he'd said, and the whole time he watched Clara sit across from her brother with her hands folded and her face careful, asking precise questions in her precise way, not forgiving and not condemning, just building. Building the case, building the record, building the wall of documented truth that Caldwell would have to come through to survive what was coming. That evening, after Joseph had gone, after she'd extracted from him everything useful and told him plainly that the rest between them would take time, and she wouldn't pretend otherwise. Clara sat on the porch steps in the cooling dark, and Ethan sat beside her. They didn't speak for a while. "He's going to want to be forgiven," she said eventually. "He's going to need it. It's the kind of man he is." "And you?" "I don't know yet." She looked at the dark. "I know I'm not ready, and I know that not being ready is allowed." A pause. "Is it allowed?" "Yes," he said. "It's allowed." She was quiet for another moment. "I keep thinking," she said, "about the day I left Nebraska. Everything I could carry in 2 bags. Standing on a train platform with those 2 bags and no idea where I was going except away." She pulled her knees up. "I thought the worst thing that could happen was that I'd end up with nothing. And then I ended up with less than nothing. And then," she paused, "and then you stopped on a road." He didn't say anything. "I've been asking myself why you stopped," she said. "Not why you gave me your reason, I understand that reason. But why it mattered to you. Why a woman you'd never seen on a road you happened to be on was something you couldn't ride past." "I told you," he said. "You told me part of it," she said. "You told me about the not crying. But there's more than that." She turned to look at him. "Isn't there?" He looked at her. He thought about Margaret and James and 3 years of a house that was too quiet. He thought about waking up most mornings with a purpose that was only practical, that was about cattle and fences and water rights and nothing larger. He thought about the particular hollowness of a life that worked technically and meant nothing. "Yes," he said. "There's more than that." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to say it tonight," he said. "Not while things are still moving the way they are. Not while you've got a federal case and a brother to navigate and a lawyer writing letters." He paused. "But I want you to know that there is more, and I intend to say it when the time is right." She was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said, softly. "All right," he said. She leaned back on her hands and looked at the sky, and he sat beside her on the porch steps, and the night sounds surrounded them. Crickets, the horses settling in the barn, the distant call of something in the hills, and the silence was the kind that held things rather than the kind that emptied them. Clara said, "I need to write to Hines about Joseph, tonight." "I know. And I need to finish the letter to the Omaha bank." "I know. And I want to start teaching myself to read land deeds." If I'm going to understand what Caldwell actually did, I need to understand the documentation. He looked at her. Where did you learn to do that? Decide you need to know something, and then just decide to know it. She considered this. I think I've always done it, she said. I just didn't have very good reasons before. She stood up, smoothed her dress, looked at him for a moment. Thank you, she said, for today, for all of it. You don't have to keep thanking me, he said. I know, she said. That's why I'm doing it. She went inside. He stayed on the porch a while longer, listening to the night. Somewhere south in the direction of town, Caldwell was sitting with his lawyers and calculating. Somewhere north, Hines was building a case that had, in the space of a week, grown from one woman's account to a documented pattern of fraud spanning the territory. Somewhere east, Elias Cook and the Delgado brothers and Mrs. Garner and every other person who had sat at his kitchen table were holding papers that told a piece of the same story. And here in a house that had been too quiet for 3 years, a lamp was burning in the kitchen, and Clara Whitmore was writing letters by its light, and the weight that Ethan had been carrying. The particular weight of purposelessness of a life that worked but meant nothing had shifted into something else. Not lighter exactly, fuller. He went inside, and without discussion, pulled out a chair at the other end of the table with his own papers, and they worked side by side through the evening, 2 people building something each in their own way at the same table. The lamp burned low. Neither of them noticed. The letter from the Federal Land Office arrived on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after Hines had filed. Ethan was in the barn when Tom came running, and the way Tom was running told him everything before he'd read a word. He took the envelope, looked at the sealed Territorial Land Office billings, and walked to the house. Clara was at the table with a land deed spread open in front of her. She'd been teaching herself the language of property documentation, the way she'd taught herself everything else that mattered systematically, without fanfare page by page, until the meaning stopped being foreign. She looked up when he came in and read his face the same way she always did. "Give it to me," she said. He gave it to her. She opened it carefully, read it once all the way through, then read it again. Then she set it down on the table with both hands and sat very still. "The preliminary review is complete," she said. Her voice was completely level. "The discrepancy in the transfer documentation has been confirmed as fraudulent. The Land Office is opening a formal investigation into Nathan Caldwell and Cheyenne land investments for fraudulent debt creation and improper land acquisition in at least 4 separate cases in Montana Territory." She paused. "My case is listed first." Ethan sat down across from her. "Clara," he said. "I'm not going to cry," she said with the decisiveness of someone arguing with themselves. "I've been not going to cry for 2 years, and I'm not going to stop now." "You can cry," he said. "It doesn't cost anything." "It costs me," she said tightly. "I decided a long time ago that I wasn't going to give anyone the satisfaction of—" "I'm not anyone," he said. She looked at him. He held her gaze, and something in her face very slowly came undone. Not collapsed. Clara Whitmore did not collapse, but undone the way a knot comes undone when the right pressure is applied in the right direction, and what came through was not weakness, but something truer than the control that had been holding it in place. She pressed both hands over her face. Her shoulders shook once, twice, 3 times. Then she pulled her hands down and looked at the ceiling and breathed. 2 years, she said. "I spent 2 years believing I had failed somehow, that I'd been stupid or careless, or that I'd missed something I should have seen. You didn't. I know that now." She brought her gaze down, looked at him directly with eyes that were bright and dry, because she had not cried and had not given anyone that satisfaction. But her face was entirely open, in a way he had not quite seen it before. "He chose me because I was vulnerable, because I was grieving and alone, and had no one to stand with me. He looked at my life and decided I was the kind of person who could be taken from." She paused. "And he was almost right." "Almost," Ethan said. "Almost," she agreed. Tom appeared in the doorway with the particular timing of a young man who had been hovering outside and could no longer contain himself. "Is it good news?" "It's good news," Ethan said. Tom let out a sound that was somewhere between a whoop and a word, and they heard Will's voice from outside answering it. And then Will was in the doorway too, and the kitchen that had been quiet for 3 years was suddenly loud in the way kitchens were supposed to be loud, with voices and movement, and Tom somehow already talking about supper as if celebrating required immediate food planning. Clara looked at all of them, and her face did the thing it had been doing more frequently in the past 3 weeks, that movement in the corner of her mouth, that particular softening, that expression she hadn't quite had words for, and Ethan hadn't pushed her to name. "We should write to Hines," she said. "We should," he agreed. "And the bank in Omaha." "Yes. And I need to understand what the restitution timeline looks like, whether the 4 other cases affect the order of resolution." She was already thinking past the moment, which was how she handled good news, just as it was how she handled bad, by finding the next thing that needed doing. "I also need to think about Joseph." "One thing at a time," Ethan said. She looked at him. "You're going to tell me to slow down. I'm going to tell you that the letter isn't going anywhere," he said. "And supper's not for 3 hours. And there's a mare in the paddock who's going to feel neglected if you don't go out there before noon." Clara pressed her lips together against something that was almost a smile. "Are you using my horse to manage me?" "Sunday would be offended by the framing," he said. "She'd say she's her own animal." This time the smile broke through fully, and it was the kind of smile that changed her whole face, not polished or controlled, but real. The smile of a woman who has just been allowed to feel something good, and is surprised by how good it actually feels. She stood up, picked up the letter, folded it, and put it in her dress pocket. Then she went outside. Ethan watched her go. Tom appeared at his elbow. "Boss?" "Yeah. You should probably also go outside," Tom said with the wisdom of a 22-year-old who understood more than he let on. "I'll handle the letter to Hines." Ethan looked at him. "You know how to write a legal letter?" "No," Tom said cheerfully. "But I know how to copy one. You wrote 3 of them last month. They're all in the drawer." He wasn't wrong. Ethan went outside. Clara was at the paddock fence, her arms resting on the top rail, and Sunday had come to her the way Sunday had taken to doing without being called, without preamble, just crossing the paddock and arriving. Clara had one hand on the mare's neck, and she was not talking to the horse, just standing there. And the letter was in her pocket, and the morning was around them, and Ethan came to stand beside her at the fence. "I want to ask you something," Clara said. She didn't look at him. "All right. You said 3 weeks ago on the porch that there was more reason than the not crying." She kept her eyes on Sunday. "You said you'd say it when the time was right." "I did say that. Is the time right?" He looked at her profile. At the line of her jaw, the set of her shoulders, the way she was holding herself very still in the particular way she got still when something mattered. "Yeah," he said. "It is." She turned to look at him. He didn't look away. "I stopped on that road," he said, "because something in me recognized something in you that I thought I'd buried with Margaret. He paused, finding the exact word, the way he always tried to find the exact word, because inexact words caused most of the trouble in his experience. Some sense that there were still things worth stopping for, that the world still had people in it worth disrupting your day over. He paused again. "I'd been riding past things for 3 years, not proud of it, but when a man's lost what I lost, he tends to pull in. Stop taking risks, stop caring about outcomes." He looked at her steadily. "And then I came around that bend in the road, and there you were, with your hands tied and your chin up, and you were not crying and not begging, and something in me said that one. That's someone who's still fighting, and I wanted to know what she was fighting for." Clara was very still. "And now you know," she said. "Now I know," he said. "And Clara—" He stopped. This was the part he'd been turning over for weeks, finding the right shape for it, the right words that were honest without being more than she was ready to hear. "I'm not asking anything of you. I know you've been asked things by people who had their own interests in the asking, and I know what that costs. I'm not that." He held her gaze. "But I'd be less than honest if I didn't tell you that what I feel when you're in that kitchen, or at that table, or sitting next to me on a wagon seat. It's the first time in 3 years that I've felt like something real is happening in my life again. And I thought you should know that." The silence between them was very full. Sunday bumped Clara's shoulder with her nose, which was Sunday's way of participating in conversations she found moving too slowly. Clara put her hand back on the mare's neck. "I have almost nothing," she said. "A letter in my pocket that might eventually result in restitution. A case that will take months. No home of my own. No resources to speak of." She paused. "I am not a good prospect, Ethan." "I didn't ask for a prospect," he said. "I asked for the person standing in front of me." She looked at him for a long time. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "Whatever this is. After Thomas, after everything, I don't trust easily. I don't—" She stopped. "I'm going to be difficult." "You've been difficult since the first morning," he said. "You reorganized my kitchen on day 2. Your kitchen needed reorganizing." "It did," he said. "I'm saying I've already adjusted." Something moved across her face. "Are you saying you want me to stay?" "Yes," he said. Simply. Just that. She looked at Sunday, at the paddock, at the house behind him with its kitchen garden that was not wild anymore, with its table where they worked side by side, with its back room door that she still latched from the inside but no longer felt the need to check twice. "I'll stay," she said, not elaborately, not with conditions or speeches. Just that the same way she did everything directly, precisely, meaning exactly what she said. He nodded. "Good. Good," she agreed. Sunday, apparently satisfied with this development, turned and walked back to the middle of the paddock. They went inside, and Clara sat down to her land deeds, and Ethan sat down to the papers Hines had asked him to compile, and Tom's very sincere attempt at a legal letter was retrieved from the drawer and gently corrected, and the morning moved forward in the way that good mornings did, full of ordinary things that mattered. Caldwell made his last move 2 weeks later. It came through his lawyers, as Hines had predicted, and it was elegant in the way that desperate things often were a counterfiling, claiming that the Whitmore property transfer had been made in good faith, based on documentation provided by the original bank, and that any discrepancy in that documentation was the bank's error, not Caldwell's, and that the federal investigation was therefore targeted at the wrong party. Hines sent Ethan a letter with the counterfiling attached and a single line of his own at the bottom. "He's trying to make the bank the villain. We expected this. The bank is not pleased." Clara read the letter, read the counterfiling, and sat at the table for 15 minutes in the particular stillness of deep thought. Then she picked up her pencil and began writing. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked. "He's saying the bank provided fraudulent documentation," she said without stopping. "Which means he's now on record claiming the bank defrauded him. The bank in Omaha is not going to tolerate being accused of fraud by the man who used their documentation to steal from a client." She kept writing. "I'm writing to the bank's attorney, pointing out that Caldwell has just given them independent legal standing to pursue him for defamation of their institution." She paused. "He's made another enemy, a larger one." Ethan looked at her. "You've been reading law," he said. "I've been reading whatever Hines sends me," she said. "And Hines sends a great deal." "Clara." She looked up. "You're extraordinary," he said. The word landed on her the way unexpected things landed on people who weren't used to them. She looked at him for a moment, with something unguarded in her face, and then she looked back at her letter. "I'm practical," she said. "Both things are true," he said. She kept writing, but the corner of her mouth moved. The bank's attorney responded within 4 days. The response, which Hines forwarded with visible satisfaction, indicated that Mercantile Bank of Omaha was initiating its own legal action against Nathan Caldwell and Cheyenne Land Investments for defamation and misrepresentation. The counterfiling had collapsed under the weight of what it had created. Hines came to Millhaven in person to deliver the news. He sat at the kitchen table where he'd sat 6 weeks ago with Clara's handwritten accounts around him, and he said, "He has 3 options now. He can settle, which means acknowledging the fraud and paying restitution to you and potentially to the other claimants. He can fight, which means going to federal court with a bank, a territorial land office, and 7 individual complainants against him. Or he can run, leave the territory and let his legal team handle the wreckage." "Which will he choose?" Clara asked. "Men like Caldwell usually choose to fight," Hines said, "right up until the moment they choose to settle, and then they pretend the settlement was their idea." "And restitution," Clara said. "My property, the farm in Nebraska." Hines was quiet for a moment. "The farm itself was sold to the railroad. That sale will be part of the investigation, but unwinding a railroad property transaction is—" he chose his words carefully, "complicated. What's more likely, and what I'm pursuing aggressively, is monetary restitution. The value of the property at time of fraudulent seizure plus damages." Clara absorbed this. "So I won't get the farm back?" "Almost certainly not. But you'll be compensated for its loss, at the rate the railroad was paying for that corridor." He paused. "It will be significant." She was quiet for a moment. Ethan watched her process it, the loss of the thing itself, the farm that had been her home with Thomas, the land along the North Creek, where her husband had always said the best of the property was. The thing you couldn't give back. "All right," she said. "That's not—" Hines started. "I know what it isn't," she said. "I also know what it is. I'm not going to pretend I'm not disappointed that a piece of land doesn't come back. But disappointed is different from defeated." She looked at him steadily. "Keep going." Hines looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had worked with many clients over many years and recognized the rare kind. "Yes, ma'am," he said. The news of the federal investigation had moved through Millhaven in the way that significant news moved through a small town faster than it should have, and with elaborations that were sometimes accurate and sometimes not. But the core of it was true, and the core was enough. Men who had sat in the saloon 6 weeks ago and listened to Caldwell's framing came quietly 1 or 2 at a time to revise their understanding. Not dramatically, people rarely revised dramatically, but in the incremental way of a community updating itself, acknowledging that a thing that had been presented one way was actually another way. Mrs. Pearson stopped Clara on the boardwalk one morning and told her with the economy of a woman who believed in precision over apology that she had been wrong to have doubts and had not had them for several weeks now, which she thought Clara should know. "Thank you, Mrs. Pearson," Clara said with matching precision. "That means something." Ruth Henderson had Clara to her house for dinner twice, and the second time she asked with the directness of a woman who had been waiting a respectable interval. "What are your intentions regarding Ethan Walker?" Clara looked at her across the dinner table. "That's a fairly personal question." "It is," Ruth agreed. "I'm asking anyway." "My intentions," Clara said, "are to stay. Everything else is—" She paused. "Still becoming." Ruth nodded, as if this were exactly the right answer. "He's been alone a long time," she said. "He doesn't do well alone. None of us do, but he's better than most at pretending he does." "I know," Clara said. "He stopped pretending when you arrived," Ruth said. "You might want to note that." Clara looked at her plate. "I noted it." Ruth passed the biscuits. Joseph Whitmore's testimony was submitted to Hines in writing 3 weeks after his visit to the ranch, and it was detailed in the way of a man who had been carrying something and was relieved to put it down. He described the exact date and location of Caldwell's approach, the specific claims Caldwell had made about Clara's situation, claims that could only have come from someone with inside access to the bank's documentation, and the pressure that had been applied to ensure Joseph's cooperation in removing Clara from the territory. When Hines read it, he wrote back a single line. "This is the premeditation we needed." Clara read that line 4 times. Then she folded the letter and put it with the others in the box she'd been keeping, a wooden box Ethan had given her, without explanation, solid and plain. that she used to hold everything that mattered to the case. She called it her evidence box. He called it privately the thing she kept her future in. On a Friday evening in late October, when the first real cold had come down from the north and the kitchen smelled of the soup that had been simmering all afternoon, Ethan came in from checking the cattle to find Clara standing in the kitchen with a letter in her hand and an expression on her face that he had learned to read but hadn't seen in quite this form before. "From Hines," she said. "What does it say?" "Caldwell is settling." She looked at the letter, then at him. "His lawyers made the approach this morning. Hines says it's a full settlement offer covering all 7 claimants. The terms are still being negotiated, but—" She stopped. "He's done fighting. He ran out of road." Ethan took off his coat, hung it on the hook behind the door, and sat down. "How do you feel?" he asked. She stood still for a moment. "I feel like the ending I've been working toward for 2 years just arrived. And now I'm standing here looking at it, and I don't know what to do with my hands." He almost smiled. "Sit down." She sat down. "It's not over," she said. "Settlement terms, documentation, formal disbursement. That's months more." "Yes." "And Caldwell will negotiate hard. He'll try to minimize the amount, try to attach conditions. Hines will not let him," Ethan said. "You know that." "I know that." She set the letter on the table. "But I want to be there. When the final terms are set, I want to be in that room." He looked at her. "You think Hines will allow that?" "I think I'll be fairly persuasive about it," she said. He did smile then fully. "Yes, I imagine you will." She looked at the letter, then at him. "Ethan, whatever the settlement amount is when it comes, I want to be clear about something. All right? I'm not staying here because of finances. I'm not staying because it's practical or because I need the security." She held his gaze. "I'm staying because this is where I want to be. And I need you to know that before money enters the picture, so that the money never gets to mean something it doesn't." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know that," he said. "I need to say it anyway." "I know that too," he said gently. She nodded once. Then she stood up and went back to the stove, and the soup needed stirring, and Tom was going to be in from the barn any minute, and the ordinary evening was reasserting itself around the extraordinary news, the way evenings did. But before she turned fully to the stove, she said, "Ethan." "Yeah, you said on the morning the investigation letter came that you'd been riding past things for 3 years, that when a man loses what you lost, he pulls in." She kept her back to him, stirring. "I want you to know that I see you, that I understand what it cost you to stop on that road, not just practically, what it cost you to open that up again, the caring about outcomes." A pause. "I don't take that lightly." He sat at the table and let that land. "Thank you," he said. She stirred the soup. Tom came in stamping mud off his boots and announced that Will had found a loose shoe on the gray horse, and they needed to get the farrier out, and the conversation folded back into the evening, and the lamp was lit, and the 4 of them sat down to supper together, the way they had been doing for weeks, which was to say like a household, like people who had chosen to be in each other's company and had stopped being surprised by how naturally that choice had taken root. November arrived, and with it, 2 things. The first snow, which came early and hard, and kept everyone close to the ranch for 3 days, and the formal settlement agreement, which arrived via Hines on the second day of the snow, with a covering letter that used the phrase "satisfactory resolution" 3 times, which Clara said was lawyer language for better than he deserved. The settlement covered all 7 claimants. Clara's portion calculated on the basis of property value at time of fraudulent seizure plus 2 years of lost income, and what Hines described as consequential damages in a tone of quiet satisfaction was more than she had let herself imagine. Not enough to buy back the Nebraska farm, which no longer existed as a farm. Enough to build something else. She read the figure twice, then she put the paper down and went to find Ethan in the barn. He was with Reckoning, which was where he usually was when he needed to think. He looked up when she came in. She told him the figure. He was quiet for a moment. "That's enough to," he started. "To buy land," she said. "Or invest in existing land. Or—" She stopped. "I have a proposal." He raised an eyebrow. "The Hendersons' East parcel," she said. "Ruth told me last week that she's been wanting to sell it for 2 years, but hasn't found a buyer she trusted. It borders your north fence line. The creek runs through the bottom corner." She looked at him. "If I bought that parcel, and I could with this settlement, and we ran it as part of Walker Ranch with a formal partnership agreement, it would expand the water rights, give us access to the summer grazing you've been leasing from Beaumont, and—" She stopped again. "And it would be mine. In my name. My ground." He looked at her. "A partnership," he said. "A legal one," she said. "With a contract, so that whatever else happens between us or doesn't happen, you never have to worry that I'm here for what's practical, and I never have to worry that I'm dependent on someone else's goodwill." She met his gaze directly. "I've been dependent on goodwill before. I need to not be that again." He was quiet for a long moment. "You already talked to Ruth," he said. "I talked to Ruth," she confirmed. "And Hines, about the partnership structure. Last week, Faiz," she said, when I was fairly confident the settlement would come through. He looked at her with an expression that was complicated and warm and something else, something she was beginning to learn to read because it was an expression he only had for her. "You planned this," he said. "I thought about it," she said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes," she said. "Planning implies certainty. I wasn't certain. I was—" She paused. "Hopeful. For the first time in a long time, I was hopeful, and I decided to let myself act like it." He stepped away from reckoning. He crossed the distance between them in 3 steps, and he took her face in both his hands, his calloused, work-rough hands, careful and deliberate, and he kissed her. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was a quiet one, the kind that had the whole weight of what had been building behind it all the mornings at the kitchen table, and the evenings on the porch, and the ride home from the saloon with her shoulder against his. The kind that meant what it meant without needing to perform it. She put one hand against his chest and kissed him back. When they broke apart, she was looking at him with her chin lifted and her eyes bright, and the particular expression that was Clara at her most unguarded, the expression that had no armor in it, just her, just the real, undefended thing. "The partnership proposal," she said. Her voice was slightly unsteady. "We should probably—" "Yes," he said. "We should probably talk about it." "Professionally," she said. "Professionally," he agreed. "At the table." At the table. Neither of them moved. Then she laughed a real laugh, sudden and warm, and completely unguarded, the laugh of a woman who has been carrying too much for too long and has just set it down. He had not heard her laugh like that before, and it hit him somewhere he hadn't expected, in the very particular place where Margaret's memory lived. And it didn't hurt the way he'd expected it to hurt. It just expanded, made room. They went to the table. They talked about it professionally. The partnership was drawn up by Hines over the following 2 weeks, and Ruth Henderson sold Clara the East parcel at a price that Ruth described as fair, and Clara described as generous, and Ruth said was neither. It was just the price she'd decided on, and she wasn't changing it. The deed was registered in Clara Whitmore's name at the Millhaven Land Office on a gray Thursday morning in late November, and Ethan stood beside her when she signed it, and when it was done, she held the document for a moment without looking at it, just held it, and he understood what she was doing, feeling the weight of it, the specific weight of a thing in your name that no one could take from you. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. She looked up at him. "I own land." "You do." "In Montana." "In Montana," he said. 17 acres along the North Creek, access to the summer grazing, and 1 very opinionated neighboring rancher. She put the deed in her coat. "I've dealt with worse. They rode back to Walker Ranch in the wagon, and the snow was coming down lightly, the early winter kind that dusted the ground and the fence posts without accumulating yet, and the world was very quiet and very white around the edges. Clara said, "Ethan." "Yeah, ask me." He glanced at her. She was looking at the road ahead. Her profile was calm, and her voice was certain, and she was not performing anything. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Clara Whitmore, I'm not asking you to forget what's behind you. I'm not asking you to pretend the last 2 years didn't happen, or to be someone different than who you are." He kept his eyes on the road. "I'm asking you to keep building with me, whatever that looks like, as long as it looks like whatever it looks like." He paused. "And I'm asking if you want that. Not if it's practical, not if it makes sense, not if it's the right decision by any ledger. Just if you want it." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I want it." He nodded once. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed. They rode in silence for a while. The snow came down. The horses moved steadily through it, patient and sure-footed. After a while, Clara said, "You know Tom is going to make this into a whole thing. Tom makes everything into a whole thing. He's going to want to celebrate. He's going to want to bake something," Ethan said, "which is terrifying for everyone." She laughed again, that real warm laugh, and it filled the cold air between them like something alive. They came up the road to Walker Ranch as the afternoon light began to go gold and thin, the way it did in November, and the house was ahead of them, with smoke coming from the chimney, because Tom had kept the fire going, and the barn door was half open, the way Will always left it, and Sunday's head appeared over the paddock fence the moment she heard the wagon. Clara saw the horse and said, "That animal has no dignity." "She knows what she likes," Ethan said. Clara looked at the house, at the smoke, at Sunday watching them come home, at the kitchen garden that was put to bed for winter now, but would come back in the spring, because she had already planned what she was going to plant in the spring. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah? I was wrong about something, when I came off that road." "What were you wrong about?" "I thought the worst thing was ending up with nothing." She looked at the house. "I didn't understand then that nothing is just where some things start." He looked at her. She looked back. And in the particular way of two people who have come through fire separately and found each other on the other side, not saved by the other, not completed by the other, but recognized genuinely and exactly recognized, they turned back toward the road and came home. The winter of 1882 settled over Walker Ranch with the unhurried permanence of things that belong. Hines wrote in January that the final disbursements from Caldwell's settlement were processing, and that 3 of the other 6 claimants had independently thanked Clara by name in their correspondence with his office, which he relayed with what read as personal satisfaction. Caldwell himself had withdrawn from most of his Montana Territory holdings and was, according to sources Hines described only as reliable, unlikely to return. Mrs. Garner came by in February with a jar of preserved plums, and stayed for 2 hours talking with Clara about property law, which Clara was still reading with the focused intent of someone building a working knowledge from the ground up. Ruth Henderson rode over twice a week through the worst of the winter on the grounds that 4 miles was nothing, and she had a good horse, and anyway she wanted to see how the east parcel drainage was holding in the cold. Tom burned 3 batches of bread, trying to teach himself to bake, and finally produced something edible in March, which he presented at supper, with the gravity of a man completing a long quest. Will said, "It's good, Tom." "I know," Tom said. Clara said, "It's genuinely good." And meant it. Tom looked at her with the pure, open gratitude of a young man being told something true, by someone whose opinion he trusted. And it was such a simple thing, such an ordinary moment, around an ordinary table. And Ethan looked at all of them, at Tom, and his bread, and Will's quiet smile, and Clara's real unguarded expression, and thought about 3 years of silence. About all the evenings this table had sat empty. He thought about a road in the summer heat, and a woman with her hands bound and her chin up, and the 2 seconds in which he had decided. He thought about all the ways a single choice makes a life. Clara caught him looking, and raised an eyebrow in her way. "What?" "Nothing," he said. She held his gaze for a moment the way she always did, reading him, assessing, understanding more than he'd said. Then she looked back at her plate. But she was almost smiling. And in the Walker Ranch kitchen with the fire going, and the snow on the ground outside, and the east parcel resting under its white blanket, waiting for spring, the evening moved forward in the way that good evenings did not dramatically. Not with flourish, but with the particular weight of something that has found its right shape and settled into it, and intends to stay. In the American West of 1882, where the land was hard and the winters were long, and the measure of a person was taken in what they did. When no one was watching, two strangers had stopped on the same road at the same moment and chosen against the odds and the cost and all the reasons not to stand in the same place. And what they built there on 17 acres along a North Creek and 8 miles of Montana range around a kitchen table and a paddock fence and a chest of evidence that had once been the only thing between a woman and erasure was not the life that had been taken from either of them. It was the one they had chosen for themselves. And in that choosing, in that deliberate and clear-eyed and fully awake choosing, it was theirs in a way that nothing taken could ever have been. Completely and without condition theirs.